Even while President Johnson talked to Chancellor Klaus about America's responsibility in a time of crisis and challenge, word came from Capitol Hill that Congress had passed and sent to the White House the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Included in the measure was a landmark open housing bill, which, when fully effective, would forbid discrimination in approximately 80% of all housing offered for rent or for sale in the United States.
Now with this bill, the voice of justice speaks again. It proclaims that fair housing for all human beings who live in this country is now a part of the American way of life. The time is here. Action must be now.
Good afternoon. My name is Carlos Torres, and I am the director of the Pittsburgh Commission on Human Relations, and I would like to welcome you to this 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act. As many of you may know, fair housing has been an important topic locally since 1959. Our city council passed legislation to protect the rights of its citizens 9 years before the Fair Housing Act was signed into law, into federal law. So Pittsburgh has a strong history of trying to protect the civil rights of its residents. One thing that is important for us to keep in mind is that our work is not done. We still have more that we need to do, because in today's world, discrimination, and particularly housing discrimination, is not necessarily open. There are not necessarily any ads that say no members of this particular race or no members of this particular religion. So now discrimination is a little bit more overt. But before we start with our activities today, I would like to thank both the Realtors Association of Metropolitan Pittsburgh and the Housing Authority of the City of Pittsburgh for their generous support of this event. Please help me give them a round of applause. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our mayor, Mayor Bill Peduto, who will offer some opening remarks for us this afternoon. Mayor Peduto.
Thank you, Director. I have to thank the Director personally. Director Torres came to Pittsburgh specifically for this opportunity and to be able to lead the Commission on Human Relations during a pretty interesting time for Pittsburgh. As most of us know, Pittsburgh for 50 years has been a city that has been losing population. We've watched neighborhoods become hollowed out, as much as 70%, 80% of our families leaving neighborhoods. Over the course of the next decade, we have the opportunity to build back neighborhoods, to return people into communities that, instead of sprawling and declining out into suburban areas, will be choosing to raise families within the city. And there's two things we have to look at. Obviously, one of them is the neighborhoods that had been left behind during these 50 years. It's not only providing housing, it's about providing a quality of life within those neighborhoods. Rebuilding not just housing, but community, meaning that the things that people need in order to survive and to thrive are a part of that community as well. Parks and open space in every neighborhood. Accessibility through transportation of all modes. The ability to have clean water and clean air. The ability to have third places, businesses and shops, churches and schools within walking distance. That's how the city was built. It was built so that each neighborhood had its own ability to thrive. And as we rebuild, we have to look at that opportunity. But there's also a second path we have to take as well. And I think that is what Dr. King and those that fought for civil rights were talking about 50 years ago, that opportunity has to be in every neighborhood, that we have to be able to find options and opportunity as we look and continue to build and to grow for everyone to be a part, so that areas where there is high market demand also have areas where there is opportunity and affordability. And that has to be our goal, both. We need to restore and rebuild Pittsburgh into a city of 90 unique, distinct, culturally identified, preservation and preserved of the past, and take that part across the bridge into the 21st century, while at the same time providing opportunity. This act that we're celebrating today was passed days after the assassination of Martin Luther King. And it came not about in the way that many acts are. It was fought through the Senate. It was debated, and it narrowly passed. And it was because of bipartisan leadership that it did get through the Senate. And it was President Johnson's goal to make sure that the bill passed before the funeral of Dr. King. And it went through the House and it was voted on. But at that same time, places like the Hill District, in Atlanta, in Washington, D.C., were on fire. I don't think Dr. King would be happy with where we're at 50 years later. As Director Torres said, we still have a lot of work to do. And I don't think that we can go back to Washington and ask Washington to fix this for us. I think it's going to have to be decided in Atlanta and in Washington and in Pittsburgh. And it's going to have to be decided by people in this room of how we want to see growth occur. We became very good at managing decline. In these next 10 years, we'll be judged on how well we can manage growth.
Thank you, Mayor Peduto. Now, for those of you who got here early, you received a program, and so you have a biography of not only our keynote speaker, but also of our panelists that will be joining us on the stage a little bit later. But it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Pearman from the University of Pittsburgh, who will be delivering our keynote address this afternoon. Dr. Pearman.
Well, thank you for that introduction. Carlos, thank you all for being here. And thank you to Janice Burley Wilson and the August Wilson Center for hosting this event. As he's getting this started, for better or worse, Pittsburgh, as of really a week ago, sits at the epicenter of a national debate about gentrification, race, displacement, and the politics of erasure. The axis of this debate falls on a rather simple binary, whether gentrification is good or bad. What's interesting is that in theory, gentrification as a process of socioeconomic upgrading at the neighborhood level can be thought of as a partial solution to what the Fair Housing Act was created to address. That is the reduction of concentrated poverty and the dismantling of racial segregation. But folks are aware of far too many cases of gentrification gone awry to subscribe to such talk. Namely the disappearance of affordable housing and the displacement of vulnerable populations. But despite the importance of naming and addressing these potential ill effects of gentrification, there are actually few accounts of how gentrification is playing out across Pittsburgh. Nor is there much evidence about how patterns of gentrification in Pittsburgh compare to what's occurring in other Rust Belt or coastal cities. In the absence of such insight, which one might describe as a sobering take of an otherwise hot-button issue, the explosive dialogue and policy stalemates that have characterized the last several years will almost certainly persist. So I argue that advancing the conversation about gentrification in Pittsburgh requires two things. One is good data about gentrification. For instance, the incidence distribution and trends associated with gentrification occurring in Pittsburgh. For the public health folks in the room, really what I'm talking about here is an epidemiological account of gentrification here in Pittsburgh. And secondly, an explicit focus on why gentrification matters, specifically the pathways by which gentrification affects outcomes of interest. So the purpose of today's talk is twofold. One, I want to describe, or I will describe recent patterns of gentrification, again, within Pittsburgh, and then describe why these changes matter for educational access and opportunity within Pittsburgh. Now, any account of neighborhood change sort of in the present is not complete without an historical account of the conditions that gave rise to where we are at the moment. Now, I'm not going to do that today for the sake of time, but I will point you to three wonderful books that deal with kind of the history of Pittsburgh neighborhoods. Urban Alchemy by Mindy Fullilove, Remaking Post-Industrial Cities, edited by Don Carter, who also has a chapter about some neighborhood change here in Pittsburgh during the 20th century. And then Mark Whitaker's The Untold Story of Smoketown, the other great Black Renaissance, which focuses on the Hill District, which was released not too long ago. So what do recent patterns of gentrification in Pittsburgh look like? First, what I'm going to be referring to is from the year 2000, more or less to present, to around 2015, where kind of accurate data is available up to. So in terms of defining gentrifying neighborhoods, so what we're looking at here is a map of sort of within Pittsburgh city limits. The blue polygons, and these polygons refer to census tracts, which is sort of a conventional way to talk about neighborhoods, at least in sort of a big data sense. The light blue on this map refers to neighborhoods that we might think of as gentrifiable neighborhoods. These are neighborhoods that at this baseline period in 2000 had experienced sustained disinvestment over an extended period of time. Here I'm defining this sort of sustained disinvestment or gentrifiable in terms of having a median income in the bottom 40th percentile of the city and a proportion of recently constructed housing that's also in the bottom 40th percentile of the city. Now, the dark blue in this map refers to neighborhoods that subsequently experienced gentrification. So again, these are neighborhoods that qualified as being gentrifiable at baseline, met the first two criteria, but in addition to those first two criteria, also experienced an increase in real housing prices and a percentile increase in college-educated residents higher than the city increase. So just to recap, so really what we're talking about here when you're looking at the map, the neighborhoods that are light blue, these are neighborhoods that remained disinvested between 2000 and 2014. The dark blue, these are gentrifying neighborhoods, right? So these are disinvested neighborhoods at 2000 that subsequently experienced an influx of college-educated residents that exceeded growth in the city overall, as well as an increase in property values. Now, the gray areas, these are neighborhoods that we might think of as higher SES neighborhoods that weren't eligible for gentrification at the beginning of this observation period. So what neighborhoods are gentrifying in Pittsburgh? Really nothing that I'm going to talk about in this little section is probably a surprise to many of you in the room. Central North Side, Lawrenceville, Strip District, East Liberty, of course, Upper Hill, Bloomfield, South Homewood, South Side Flats. So of the roughly 700 neighborhoods that comprise the broader Pittsburgh metro area, 31 are gentrifying. So immediately one question is, well, is that a lot? Is that a little? One way to kind of situate this rate is by comparing it to what's going on in other Rust Belt cities, other coastal cities. So Rust Belt cities, we're talking about Detroit, Cleveland, Akron, Buffalo, cities like that. Coastal cities like New York, LA, San Francisco, DC, Seattle. What's interesting about the coastal cities in terms of the contemporary discourse around gentrification, so many influential journalists are from these coastal cities that they sort of dominate the conversation about what's happening in terms of gentrification. But as I'll show later in this presentation, there's quite a few differences in terms of neighborhood change in coastal cities versus Rust Belt areas. But to the point about overall rates of gentrification, I just mentioned a moment ago, about 4.5% of neighborhoods in Pittsburgh have experienced gentrification. That's slightly more than the Rust Belt average, but it's about 50% less than what's going on or what's been going on in coastal cities. So what does all this neighborhood change mean for the well-being of children? This is sort of the premise of my talk. Understanding the consequences of gentrification requires careful attention to the processes underway in gentrifying neighborhoods and how these processes relate to changes in educational access and opportunity. So I'll advance sort of this conceptual framework that'll help organize the remainder of my talk. First, you could think about gentrification having sort of a direct effect on children's educational outcomes. But you can think about this effect also coming about through an indirect effect through changes in neighborhood social ecology, which I'll define here in a moment. You can also think about gentrification having an effect on children's educational outcomes by way of changes in the institutional composition of a neighborhood. You can think about gentrification having an effect on educational outcomes by way of changes to environmental conditions. And lastly, you can think about gentrification affecting educational outcomes by way of affecting residential stability within the neighborhood. So I'm going to start first with social ecology. So what I'm referring here in general terms is simply that gentrification can alter who lives in a neighborhood and the types of interactions that take place in the neighborhood. So much of the reason that the middle class is lionized in conversations about urban redevelopment is for their generative capacities, not only for the economic resources they bring to poor urban neighborhoods, but also for their capacity to quote unquote, proper ways of being, quote, good citizens, right? In fact, this is precisely the theory of change undergirding new urbanist philosophies of mixed income development, popularizing in cities across the country. To the contrary, the evidence in favor of these sorts of trickle-down benefits of gentrification are rather limited. First, gentrifying households often self-segregate within newly gentrified neighborhoods, engaging in very little social mixing with low-income households. In other words, there's an important difference between propinquity and social integration. That's kind of a fancy way of saying that there's a difference between living next to someone and sharing life with someone. Moreover, positive interactions may be undermined by any resentment on the part of existing residents who live in low-income neighborhoods prior to the onset of gentrification and who see socio-demographic change as a threat to their own socioeconomic or well-being, which is likely compounded when gentrification is characterized by racial turnover as well. So these types of shifts in the social ecology of a gentrifying neighborhood are exemplified in a very frontal way in really the brouhaha surrounding this sign, right? Which, as many of you all know, was recently taken down from atop the Warner Building in East Liberty. The sign itself was created by artist Aisha Wormsley and was intended really to inspire reflection on recent changes in East Liberty community and affirm the place of black people in the future of it. An affirmation that really gained significance in light of several recent mass evictions in East Liberty that sent a number of black families moving to other areas of the city. What the sign and really the reaction to it and the reaction to it really being taken down, what it reminds us of is that social integration in gentrifying neighborhoods, in particular forming the types of social networks and bonds that really proponents argue would facilitate the transfer of quote-unquote middle-class norms and values conducive for educational success, is really a highly complex process that may be contingent on a number of factors, including demographic differences, residential histories, and attitudes and dispositions toward neighbors. Now, another aspect of social ecology that's important to highlight is gentrification can affect patterns of crime and violence. There's quite a bit of evidence that have kind of examined this link. What's interesting is gentrification leads to short-term upticks in crime, but over time, as gentrification sets in, crime and violence actually decline quite a bit. Why that matters is prior research has linked exposure to crime, exposure to community violence with depressed academic achievement on standardized assessments, lower grade point average, decreased school attendance, and decreased likelihood of school completion. Right, so given this sort of robust link between exposure to crime and depressed academic achievement, children will likely fare better in the long run in terms of their academic success if gentrification does in fact reduce their exposure to crime. So in terms of, so I was just kind of describing sort of the interactional effects that gentrification can have in terms of the demography of a community. Now in terms of strict demographic change, what's interesting here, so what we're looking at in the top row, this is all Pittsburgh neighborhoods. I don't know if you guys can see this red dot, but the top row refers to all Pittsburgh neighborhoods, not just the ones that are gentrifying or the ones that are non-gentrifying. This is all Pittsburgh neighborhoods. The bottom three rows, these are gentrifying neighborhoods in Pittsburgh. These are gentrifying neighborhoods in the Rust Belt, and these are the bottom row is gentrifying neighborhoods in coastal cities. And what you see is gentrification is associated with population declines in the Rust Belt, including Pittsburgh, but not coastal cities, right? So, first, what's interesting about sort of narratives of gentrification, so much of it is about sort of the repopulation of disinvested urban neighborhoods in terms of population growth. That is the case in coastal areas, in gentrifying neighborhoods in coastal areas. That's not the case at all in Pittsburgh, nor is it the case in Rust Belt cities more generally, in which we're actually seeing a decline in the total population in gentrifying neighborhoods here in Pittsburgh. Here we're looking at the same kind of population shifts, but we're also looking at it within gentrifying neighborhoods within Pittsburgh, right? And here we see populations rose in the central north side, in the south side, and in the Strip district, but all others decreased and decreased quite a bit in some cases, right? So East Liberty, for instance, saw a decline of nearly 700 residents between 2000 and 2014. Same with South Homewood, had a decline of 660 or so. What's interesting about sort of this, what we're seeing here in terms of the variation, there's some neighborhoods in Pittsburgh that look very coastal in terms of this demographic change, others that look much more Rust Beltish, right? Black residents declined in absolute number in the Rust Belt and coastal cities alike. So this sort of broader narrative around sort of the displacement of black residents from gentrifying households, that's certainly holding up here in Pittsburgh in terms of the average gentrifying neighborhood in Pittsburgh saw a decline of about 150 black residents, which interestingly is slightly less than the Rust Belt average, which is about 200, and still less than what's going on in the coastal area. But this broader trend about the outmigration of black households from gentrifying neighborhoods is fairly consistent across all of these neighborhood types. But interestingly, the magnitude of the loss of black households varied significantly across gentrifying neighborhoods in Pittsburgh, right? So here we're looking at, for instance, East Liberty, right? We saw a decline of about 900 black households in East Liberty. In South Homewood, about 700. In the central north side, a decline of about 250. Friendship, a decline of about 280. But the fact is, across the board, a decline, but that decline varied, again, in magnitude, depending on the neighborhood type. Now, here's something intriguing as well. The number of white households also fell in gentrifying neighborhoods in Pittsburgh. However, this contrasts with the predominant pattern in coastal cities, right? So in coastal areas, you saw an overall increase in the number of white households in gentrifying neighborhoods. Here in Pittsburgh, again, just to remind you, in Pittsburgh, we're seeing an overall decline in total population. Part of that decline in total population is an outmigration of black households. We're also seeing an outmigration of white households as well, on the order of about 170 on average in gentrifying neighborhoods in Pittsburgh. And in Rust Belt, similarly saw a decline of about 60 white households in Pittsburgh. The number of white residents, however, increased sharply in some neighborhoods. So the point here is there are some neighborhoods in Pittsburgh that, again, look quite coastal. For instance, the central north side saw an increase of about 300 white residents. The Strip district saw an increase in about 400, over 400. Same with the South Side Flats. But then, there are some, some cases that again sort of index this broader pattern that white households are also seeing some measure of displacement in gentrifying neighborhoods in Pittsburgh as well. So here we're looking at the change in the share of the college-educated population in gentrifying neighborhoods. So typically this is really the population that's driving a lot of this change. And here, what's intriguing to me is the growth in the share of college-educated residents was sharpest in gentrifying neighborhoods in Pittsburgh, even more so than the change in gentrifying neighborhoods in Seattle, in New York, in LA. And even more than what's going on in the Rust Belt, Pittsburgh is seeing sort of the steepest growth in what Richard Florida refers to as sort of this creative class eligible population, which are these college-educated residents. So in sum, with respect to social ecology, gentrification is associated with declining overall population in Pittsburgh neighborhoods. Overall, these population declines pertain to black and white households alike, although these relationships are more pronounced for black residents, especially in some neighborhoods. Notable exceptions to this sort of black and white households being displaced. Notable exceptions include East Liberty, Central North Side, Strip District, and South Homewood, in which the outmigration of black households far exceeded that of the outmigration of white households. The most promising socio-ecological mechanism that gentrification or the most promising sort of pathway within the social ecological mechanism path appears to be related to changes in crime and violence, right? And that's reductions in crime and violence, and how those reductions then induce more positive effects on children's educational attainment and the like. So the second pathway that I want to talk about is gentrification-induced changes to the institutional composition of neighborhoods, and subsequently how those changes can impact children's educational outcomes. So again, gentrification affects neighborhoods' institutional composition. You can think of this in two ways, right? You can think about institutions, enterprises, businesses, and so forth, targeting particular communities that are undergoing, that have a particular population or that are seeing increases in particular populations, and targeting those for locations. You can also think about it as sort of the flip side, that being neighborhoods that perhaps are undergoing particular change, residents advocating for particular organizations to set up shop in their neighborhood. Here we're looking at, obviously, the Whole Foods in East Liberty. Here's a Boys and Girls Club in the Lawrenceville area. It's a fancy restaurant over in Lawrenceville, as well as a yoga shop or a yoga studio in the East Liberty area as well. Here we're looking at the change in the number of residents the change in the number of restaurants per 10,000 residents, so sort of a per capita measure of restaurant change. And what we can see here is Pittsburghers love their food, especially in gentrifying areas. Pittsburgh has between 2000 and 2014, the per capita number of restaurants in gentrifying areas of the city increased by about 5.5. That's twice what folks are seeing in coastal cities, and a good bit more than what folks in gentrifying areas in the Rust Belt are experiencing as well, right? Now, in terms of grocery stores, right, overall, Pittsburgh saw a slight decline in the per capita number of grocery stores. In coastal cities, gentrifying areas in coastal cities actually saw an increase in the per capita number of grocery stores. Same with the Rust Belt. However, in Pittsburgh, there was a slight decline in the number of grocery stores. Now, again, these are grocery stores. These are all grocery stores. So, every grocery store in gentrifying areas is not Whole Foods, right? We got a number of other grocery stores as well. But here we're just seeing that there are fewer grocery stores at the end of this observation period in which disinvested communities undergo gentrification. So what about institutions that exclusively serve low-income residents, right? So we can think about demographic change associated with gentrification inducing a particular type of change, such that the institutions that are otherwise focused on a particular population see their clientele perhaps displaced, and their clientele eventually sort of drying up, right? So I think it's particularly interesting to look at changes in these types of organizations. So here we're looking at the change in social service providers. So over this, between 2000 and 2014, all of Pittsburgh actually saw an increase of about a little over 4 social service providers per capita. However, in gentrifying neighborhoods in Pittsburgh, there was actually a decline of social service providers, right? And it doesn't seem like a lot, and it's not a terrible, a big decrease. But what's interesting is these are per capita estimates, right? So we already documented that gentrifying areas in Pittsburgh saw a decline in total population. So even if the number of social service providers stayed the same over the observation period, you would see an increase in the number of social service providers per capita, right? So the fact that we're seeing a decline indicates that there's actually what we might think of as an outmigration of social service providers as well. And that stands in contrast to what's going on in Rust Belt and other coastal cities, right, where gentrification is associated with an increase in the number of social service providers, right? So a really intriguing, perhaps troubling trend in gentrifying areas in Pittsburgh as well. Here we're looking at the changes in the number of child and youth services. So this is sort of a subcategory of social service providers. And here too, we're seeing a decline in the number of child and youth services in gentrifying areas in Pittsburgh, which stands in contrast to what's going on in other Rust Belt cities, and stands in contrast to what's going on or what's happened in Pittsburgh more generally. So what about neighborhood schools, right? So first we can think about gentrification inducing a particular type of change in which higher SES, more affluent families relocate to neighborhoods and then send their kids to the neighborhood schools, right? So if that does in fact happen, we would see aggregate increases in the socioeconomic status of neighborhood schools. Why that matters is a higher socioeconomic profile of the school would likely be associated with improved schooling inputs, including more highly qualified teachers, right? Improved facilities, the availability of advanced courses, more rigorous curriculum, improved schooling climates. These are changes in the in teacher-student relations, parent-teacher relations, and the like. However, it's important to note that kind of many of these improvements, such as access to quality instruction, seats in advanced courses, or admission into a flagship magnet program, are limited resources, right? And there's quite a bit of work that sort of examined this effect, especially in like ethnographic work and educational research. And limited school resources often wind up in the hands of the savviest households, right? Which is unsurprising to many. But it's also important to note that that whole kind of train of thought that I just mentioned in terms of how gentrification can induce improvements in neighborhood schools is sort of rooted in, or it's kind of premised on this idea that gentrifying households actually send their kids to those schools, right? But there's evidence that this doesn't always apply. In fact, there's quite a bit of evidence to say that it applies much less frequently than what we would otherwise think. So I've done some work specifically on this issue that was covered recently in The Atlantic and a few other news outlets. And what I've found is that school choice increases the likelihood that communities of color experience gentrification, right? So what myself and a colleague down in the University of Georgia who I conducted this work with, what we found was as school choice options expand, as charter school options expand, magnet school options expand, inter-school choice policies, voucher programs, as these choice elements expand, affluent white households in particular are more likely to move into communities of color, right? So what this is suggesting is that how tightly coupled neighborhoods are to the schools that serve them is a strong predictor of residential sorting patterns. And if you disrupt that linkage, if you make it if you allow these families to send their kids to non-neighborhood schools, they're more likely to move into these communities, such that the most racially isolated neighborhoods of color, and this is across the country, these estimates, the most racially isolated neighborhoods of color, the probability of gentrification actually doubles, goes up by about 22 percentage points in terms of the probability of gentrification. So in terms of these gentrification-induced changes in the institutional composition of neighborhoods, gentrification is associated with changes to the institutional composition of neighborhoods, obviously. Some evidence that institutions that target low-income children may lose out over time, especially here in Pittsburgh. There's little evidence that schools themselves will improve naturally as gentrification sets in. Now, it's important to emphasize sort of naturally. We can think about potential policy solutions to sort of address or ensure that schools are able to realize some of these socioeconomic benefits accruing to their surrounding neighborhoods. Another pathway through which gentrification can affect educational outcomes is by changes in environmental conditions, right? So gentrification often leads to environmental interventions, which generally contributes to improved quality of life for neighborhood residents. Favorable changes to environmental conditions are generally promotive of children's well-being. Here, what I'm referring to are like park restoration projects. The Cat Park is currently in the works, right in the lower Hill District area. The creation of so-called green spaces, right? The expansion of health food outlets, the rehabilitation of old or abandoned buildings. These types of changes, there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest that these types of changes are promotive of positive outcomes for children. However, there's a and again, just re-emphasizing the point I just made in terms of research suggests that these sorts of favorable changes to environmental conditions are generally promotive of children's mental and physical health as well as their academic success. There's also like a cautionary note here as well, and that's, there's been work around the notion of environmental gentrification, which has found that environmental interventions can be promotive of gentrification. So what I was, this sort of pathway that I was just describing was gentrification inducing these changes in the environment. There's quite a bit of work to suggest that there's this like recursive thing going on one where improvements in the environmental conditions actually invite more gentrification, so neighborhoods become more appealing, right? So for those who are sort of concerned about the potential spillover effects or the adverse effects of gentrification, environmental improvements can promote some of those concerns, or deepen some of those concerns. So in sum, gentrification leads to improved environmental conditions that may be promotive of children's well-being. Environmental improvements may themselves further promote gentrification, which may intensify potential adverse consequences. The final kind of pathway that I want to highlight is changes in residential instability, or changes in residential stability in communities that are undergoing gentrification, and ultimately what those effects can have on children's eventual well-being, but their educational access and opportunity in the moment. Before I mention this, it's also important to note, and this comment is somewhat controversial, but the extent to which gentrification fosters residential displacement is actually hotly debated in the empirical literature. What this is really getting at is gentrification, and it's more accurate to think of displacement as a potential outcome of gentrification. So a lot of folks or at least in sort of the public imaginary of gentrification, think of the two as one and the same. But there are cases of socioeconomic improvements of neighborhoods in which folks are not displaced, right? But that doesn't undermine the fact that it does in fact happen, and when it does happen, it is deeply concerning, right? Recent studies on residential instability have documented significant adverse effects of unplanned or involuntary moves on a range of developmental outcomes, and again, unplanned or involuntary moves. That's gentrification-induced displacement. That's a case of what that is. The effects of residential displacement can be direct, so we can think about sort of disrupted instruction in school or increased net stress engagement for children. They can be indirect through sort of disrupted peer networks or changes in household routines. You can also think about sort of indirect effects through parental stress, right, and how that affects parenting strategies. Now, more to sort of the demographic trends happening in Pittsburgh and other cities that relate to patterns of displacement. So gentrifying neighborhoods in Pittsburgh between 2000 and 2014 saw property values increase by about $33,000. In coastal cities, the increase was over $200,000. So the point is not to minimize what $33,000 in terms of property values is. It is a substantial amount of money. But just to sort of contextualize this a bit, it's about half as much as what's going on in Rust Belt cities more generally during the same observation period, and a great deal lower in terms of the increase than what's going on in coastal cities. Property value increases were sharpest in the central north side, Strip District, and south side. The point here is, again, gentrifying neighborhoods, all gentrifying neighborhoods by definition have an increase in property values, but these varied. So central north side saw an increase of, and these are inflation adjusted, right? So an increase of about $125,000, thousand real dollars. Southside Flat Strip District hovered around $100,000. Lower Lawrenceville saw an increase of about $63,000. Changes in median rent were more modest in Pittsburgh than in other Rust Belt and coastal cities. The pattern here is similar to what we observed for the housing prices. Overall increase in Pittsburgh was about $82. Median rental price increase was about $150 in Pittsburgh. Rust Belt about $220. Coastal cities about $330. Gentrifying neighborhoods in Pittsburgh and the Rust Belt saw declines in the housing stock, not the case in coastal cities. So here we're looking at the change in the number of housing units. These are available units. And this is even more encompassing than affordable housing. This is all housing, right? And what's really intriguing, in Pittsburgh, there's fewer houses. There's fewer housing units overall in gentrifying neighborhoods at the end of sort of this observation period. So gentrification is actually, we could talk about gentrification being associated with declines in overall housing units. Now again, this is the value of sort of cross-city comparisons. Look what's going on in coastal cities, right? So coastal cities are actually seeing increases in the housing stock, right? The average gentrifying neighborhood in coastal cities saw an increase of about 130 housing units. In Pittsburgh and the Rust Belt, we're seeing fewer housing units as gentrification sets in. Over half of gentrifying neighborhoods saw a decline in the number of available housing units. Here we're just disaggregating what we were just talking about in terms of the gentrifying neighborhoods within Pittsburgh. So again, there's some neighborhoods such as Southside Flats Strip District that's sprouted up all these new fancy apartments and so forth. But in general, I mean, shucks, look at East Liberty. Over 300 fewer housing units in East Liberty in 2014 than were present in 2000. Similarly in South Homewood, saw a sharp decline. And this contrast, again, in Pittsburgh overall, we saw a slight increase. So in terms of home ownership rates, right? So between 2000 and 2014, Pittsburgh metro area saw an increase of about a little over 2% in terms of home ownership rates. In terms of gentrifying neighborhoods in Pittsburgh, there was an increase, but not as much as what happened in Pittsburgh overall. Rust Belt cities actually saw the sharpest increase in home ownership rates. Coastal cities saw an increase of about 4 percentage points in terms of home ownership rates. However, these rates in terms of changes in home ownership rates varied quite a bit in terms of neighborhoods within Pittsburgh. You had neighborhoods such as South Homewood that saw really a marked increase in the share of households that own their homes. But again, that sort of varied. The other end of the spectrum, there's in the Strip District, Upper Hill District actually saw a decline in home ownership rates. Black residents, and I alluded to this point earlier when we were talking about sort of the changes of the social ecology and just simply changes in who lives in the neighborhood. Just to reiterate this point, there are fewer black residents on average in gentrifying neighborhoods in Pittsburgh. And that change varies, again, across neighborhoods where it's most intense in East Liberty, South Homewood, but really declines across the board. And similarly, we're seeing declines in the number of white households as well. Now, that's not as consistent of a decline across Pittsburgh neighborhoods. Again, you have neighborhoods that actually look more coastal, such as the Central North Side, Southside Flat Strip District, that saw increases in the number of white households. But on average, they too are experiencing a decline across all gentrifying neighborhoods in Pittsburgh. So in some, residential instability is bad for children. Property values and rental price increases in gentrifying Pittsburgh neighborhoods have risen, but less so than what's occurred in the Rust Belt and coastal cities. Overall housing stock in gentrifying Pittsburgh neighborhoods has decreased. Right, so that kind of summarizes this sort of broad sort of conceptual framework for how we can think about gentrification affecting children's educational outcomes by way of modifications to these 4 pathways of interest. So kind of broad summary. So gentrification in Pittsburgh remains relatively rare, affecting 4.5% of Pittsburgh neighborhoods. Population declines and growth of vacant properties distinguish Pittsburgh and other Rust Belt gentrification from that occurring in coastal cities. Pittsburgh property values have increased, but really at a fraction of what's occurred in other Rust Belt and coastal cities. There's some evidence that gentrification may adversely impact institutions that serve low-income residents in Pittsburgh. There's considerable heterogeneity across Pittsburgh neighborhoods in terms of the type of change brought about by gentrification. So some Pittsburgh neighborhoods look coastal, others look very Rust Belt-ish. Residential displacement is observed really across racial lines, but is especially pronounced for black residents in some Pittsburgh neighborhoods, for instance, East Liberty, South Homewood. So moving the conversation forward, I know we have a full day today. I just want to kind of drop one question for you to kind of ponder as you go through the rest of this day. And that's, in the spirit of the Fair Housing Act, what would equitable gentrification look like in Pittsburgh? And then secondly, what would it mean for Pittsburgh neighborhoods to be resilient in the face of gentrification? I will also say, so I just got on social media a couple months ago, and I've recognized the value of social media in terms of information exchange, idea exchange. So for those of you who are on it, I'd love to exchange comments with you through that source. Also, my email address, love to set up conversations to meet with anybody in the audience who's interested in examining some of these trends more specifically. So really, in sum, having good data about gentrification and focusing the conversation on the pathways by which gentrification matters allows for more fruitful, honest, expansive, and equitable dialogue about the intersection of race, urban redevelopment, and the future of Pittsburgh neighborhoods. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pearman, for that presentation. So I know that for many of the people in the audience today and many people who are long-term residents of Pittsburgh, some of this information is not new. Like, you know, because you look around your neighborhood and you know that the neighborhood that has been there for 30, 40, 50 years is no longer there. But now I think the value of having this information available to us is that now we have actual data, useful data. So it's no more about what I see with my own eyes or what I hear from neighbors, friends, family members, but now we have data that is available to us. And I think it's a great starting point, as has been mentioned throughout this last few years here in Pittsburgh. How do we now use the information that's available to us to help us reverse some of these patterns or prevent some of these incidents from taking place in the future? How can we do that in a manner that is consistent with neighborhood identity, consistent with neighborhood traditions, and consistent with the values of us as a city? So, great food for thought. I will encourage those of you who are active in social media or who are interested in the data that was presented today to take up Dr. Pearman's challenge, to reach out to him and engage in that exchange, because I think it will be really valuable as we move forward as a city in our housing policies a year from now, 10 years from now, 25 years from now. So thank you, Dr. Pearman, again for that excellent presentation. And now we're going to show a short video from our partners and colleagues at the Realtors Association of, this is from the National Realtors Association, but was made available to us through the local Realtors Association of Metropolitan Pittsburgh.
On April 11, 1968, the Fair Housing Act was enacted into law, recognizing that property rights should not be abridged because of discrimination based on race, color, national origin, or religion. Resistance, harassment, and violence are unfortunately hallmarks of the pursuit of equal housing in our country. For generations, access to housing of choice didn't mean access for all. Where you lived was often dictated by the color of your skin.
There was a thing known as white flight. If there are 2 or 3 African Americans in a block, then it's time to go. Real estate brokers that were taking full advantage of those fears, of that flight. That's how many of the communities were changing block by block through the course of a summer.
But the population was discriminating. You know, the neighborhood, whenever a person of color came into a neighborhood, people would begin to sell. They panic, you know. It was awful, you know.
In the mid-'70s, I was showing a black couple through a home, and I got a phone call from a neighbor who used very offensive language and told me that if I sold that house to that person or that group, that they would do physical harm.
We acknowledge our industries and associations' early opposition to fair housing and recognize those individuals and organizations that helped change our policy. For example, in 1947, African American real estate brokers formed the National Association of Real Estate Brokers with a clear fair housing purpose.
And that certainly started to give me a platform necessary to not only talk with my realtor brothers and sisters, but to work even more diligently within the community which we came from, which was denied opportunities of property ownership.
Many people have given much of their lives to advance the cause of fair housing, often risking more than just their livelihoods. Despite continued opposition across the country, the Fair Housing Act declared a national policy of fair housing by prohibiting discrimination based on race, color, religion, and national origin. Changing attitudes and behaviors proved to be difficult.
And the community organizations attacked us that first year, breaking our office windows, demonstrating in front of the office, coming into office. There was a network of ladies that were at home that would call and jam our telephones. Stop selling in our neighborhood, click up. Stop blockbusting in our neighborhood, click up, et cetera, et cetera.
Progress has been made. The Fair Housing Act was amended in later years to prohibit discrimination based on gender, disability, and familial status, and to increase enforcement of the law.
So when we looked at it and said, now, wait a minute, this makes good business sense to be a positive person in the real estate market and following the fair housing law, that we should get out there and do something to prove and help our members know that they're doing the right thing.
When I started out, I remember having people that say, well, I want to go to this neighborhood, but I don't want to go to that neighborhood. And it seems like over time, I mean, we're talking 30-something years, I don't get those questions asked. Where I live, everywhere, there's people all sorts of race, creed, color, age. It's a true melting pot.
But many communities remain segregated, and housing discrimination based on race, religion, and more still exists. Only half the country prohibits discrimination in housing against the LGBT community, and HUD reports that the highest proportion of complaints involve discrimination based on disability. Each of us, as realtors, as business leaders, or leaders in our local, state, and national associations, have a role to play in this commemoration. Today, we're leading efforts to expand fair housing protections based on sexual orientation and gender identity. We must strive, together with our partners, to define how to bring about a market that's truly open and provides equal housing opportunities. We are not alone in commemorating the Fair Housing Anniversary. We are working together with our partners and allies to show that our industry is firmly committed to equal housing opportunities and recognizes the unique and important role each organization and each of us has in this monumental endeavor.
Fair housing has made us stronger in a lot of different ways. One of them is protecting us in all of these areas: race, religion, familial status, age, everything.
Well, we just doing the right thing for people, for everybody. So we're doing what's ethical and what's right.
Our Fair Housing Center and the Grand Rapids Association of Realtors works in coordination with each other to make sure that fair housing is absolutely there for all.
How will you participate in commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act? After all,
fair housing.
Fair housing.
Fair housing.
Fair housing makes us stronger.
Makes us stronger.
Makes us stronger.
So again, thanks to our partners from the Realtors Association of Metropolitan Pittsburgh for making this available to us. I believe it's a strong message for all of us to hear that and really understand that we're not on this fight alone, that we have partners in our realtors. The other piece, for those of you who received the blue bags when you went through the registration table, there's a pamphlet there from the Commission on Human Relations that describes for you in the very front the different protected classes that are, or the rights that are available to different members of protected classes right here in Pittsburgh. Now, it's really important for you to know that the protections vary by jurisdiction. So the federal government offers some protections, the state government offers some protections, the county offers some protections, and the city offers its own protections as well. And by far, in the city, we have more protections than that of the federal government and even the state government. For example, in the city of Pittsburgh, it is illegal to discriminate against a person based on their gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation. That is not provided under the law, the federal law, or the state law. So it's really important for you to be aware of what those protections are and how to assert your rights if you feel that your rights are being violated. This afternoon, we're very honored to have a very distinguished panel for us to kind of pick their brains a little bit. So we have Ms. Barbara Delaney, who's the Deputy Director of the HUD Mid-Atlantic region. Her office is based in Philadelphia. We have Mr. Josh Moses, who's a housing advocate right here from Pittsburgh, we have Ms. Esther Bush. Ms. Esther Bush, who is the CEO of the Urban League of Greater Pittsburgh. We have Mr. Charles Morrison, who's the former director of the Pittsburgh Commission on Human Relations, and he served in that role for many years. And of course, last but not least, we have David Dean, who's the current president of the Realtors Association of Metropolitan Pittsburgh, a member of the AFFH Task Force, and one of the sponsors of our event today. We have some written questions that we're going to ask the panelists. We're going to go about an hour or so having a discussion with the panelists. The next thing is a small break, a 30-minute break, and we have snacks that will be available for you in the same area where the lunch was earlier today. And then we're going to come back around 3:30 or so, and then we're going to allow questions from the audience to our panelists. The afternoon is going to end with some closing remarks from the office of U.S. Senator Casey this afternoon. So as our panelists get situated, the first question right here, this is a 1937 map of Pittsburgh, and it was what many of you will probably recognize, the redlining map. And to some extent, some of those characteristics may still be in place today, but I wanted to show this as historical context for us, because we just heard Dr. Pearman talked about gentrification and which neighborhoods were kind of right for gentrification. And so this map, and for those of you who may not be familiar, this map is color-coded. The areas that are green were considered to be good investment areas. Yes, back in 1937. The areas that are blue are still okay, but they're not necessarily as good as the green. The yellow are kind of so-so, and by that time, as called at the time, African Americans were moving into the yellow area, so that's why they were being coded that way. And the red areas were definitely areas in which banks will not approve home loans for individuals to be able to purchase homes. So this is where the term redlining comes from. And obviously, the lack of opportunity for investment created segregated neighborhoods. So in the context of this map, what Dr. Pearman just talked to us about, and our celebration today, any of the panelists, where do you think we are? Are we better off, or are we worse off than when the Fair Housing Act was signed?
I'll go. All right. To be very honest, we're in about the same place in terms of the number of African Americans. When we look at the color piece, we own about the same number of houses now that we literally did 50 years ago. Was it important for the Fair Housing Act to be passed? Has it made a difference? Absolutely, because it's causing people to talk. It's causing issues to be raised. And so just the fact that we're talking about it is extremely important. And there has been, and we'll get into this later, but a number of other laws that have come up that has supposedly strengthened or closed the loopholes. But yes, Martin Luther King Jr. deserved to have his economic impact through fair housing passed in his honor, as the mayor stated a week after he was assassinated. But we are still so far from where we need to be. But we're about in the same place.
Great.
If I could get in the time machine and go back to 1968, this time of year in 1968, if you stepped outside of this building and you looked to the right, you would see a sky full of smoke. This city was on fire in April of 1968. This city was not alone. And it was that unrest that made the Congress and the Senate of this country step up and pass that law. They did it in record time, and they did it because they had no other choice. America was in deep trouble in 1968. Now, when you step out of these doors now, you won't see smoke in that sky. But things have changed, some for the better, some not so much so. Clearly, the law, the way it began in 68 was a kind of a soft sell, if I may use that term, a soft sell. There was no teeth in the law. Pittsburgh had a law before the Fair Housing Act, as the director said. But that law didn't have teeth in it either. The commission can order a seller to sell the house. They could order a remedy in terms of the actual losses. But in terms of actually punishing someone who has committed an act of discrimination, that didn't happen until the 1988 amendments to the Fair Housing Act, when teeth were put in the law. I worked in this area of the law about 6 years. 1974, I came into enforcement. And when we were engaged in a case where we found discrimination, we would engage in what they called conciliation. Quite often, the end result was a consent order, which had the full force and effect of a public order following a commission hearing. That consent order required that person to fully comply with the law, et cetera, et cetera. But there was very little in terms of any penalty, in terms of loss of, a monetary loss of some kind. So they would reluctantly sign these consent decrees. But things have changed so much over time that in the early days, people would say, well, yes, I did not rent to them. Not that I have a problem with them. It's my neighbors have a problem with them. And that's why I can't rent to them or sell to them, because I fear for them. So that's what we heard back in the early 70s. Now you don't hear that. As some will tell you, you get a smile, you get a handshake, and we'll be in touch.
We'll call back.
That's what happens. So things have changed. They have changed for the better. I think without a doubt when the law was amended to put teeth in it, that made the difference.
I'd just like to reiterate what Charlie said. So one of the things that the Fair Housing Act did, as Charlie indicated, there were amendments throughout 1968. And more importantly, in 1995, civil penalties were adopted in the Fair Housing Act. And for civil penalties, that was really imperative because, again, individuals that had, for a first violation, property manager or a particular company where we found that there was discrimination did occur, they could be they would have to pay a civil penalty, and that wasn't until 1995. And just recently, for a first offense, I think it was probably somewhere around $16,000 for a first offense. But just recently in 2015, for a civil penalty for a first violation could be anywhere from $19,000 all the way up to $98,000. For a particular, as we say, a person that violated the Fair Housing Act, and that also includes, and that doesn't include emotional distress damages and/or attorney's fees. So it did have some teeth. And prior to that, also, as Charlie indicated, during, I think it was in 1997, the Fair Housing Act, it was amended to have our Fair Housing Initiative program. And that enabled fair housing organizations, FIP organizations as we call them, to actually conduct outreach and education. They had the ability to conduct testing and enforcement initiatives under the FIP programs. In addition to that, the state and localities, the Human Relations Commission, they had the ability, what we call substantially equivalent, where they actually can investigate cases of discrimination and bring a claim under their state and locality. So there's been multiple amendments to the Fair Housing Act that have benefited all individuals. More importantly, it was amended twice in 1988. The disability was added as a protected class. Sex was added as a protected class. Also in 1995, you had persons for older persons that you could actually have housing that was for older persons, where you could actually say, because again, senior living facilities specifically, where you could have a senior living facility where you could say that children are not permitted. So those are just some of the few amendments that really transpired. But for me, more importantly, when you think about the Supreme Court decision versus the Olmstead decision, where it was that persons with disabilities, they had to deinstitutionalize individuals and actually put them in areas where that they had an opportunity to thrive. And so again, when you talk about some of the amendments under the Fair Housing Act, there has been some, there has been some progress. But as Charlie and my colleagues on the stage have indicated, we have a long way to go.
Mr. Moses, you've been doing this work for a few years, and so from your experience and your perspective, are we better or are we worse?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here today. It's an honor to be sharing the stage with these great individuals. We have a long way to go. As you've heard about taking us back in the time capsule, I was in that time capsule, 1967. Just came home from Vietnam, tried to buy a house, my wife and I. Couldn't do it in the neighborhoods we wanted. It was very hard. Ended up buying a house in the neighborhood called Knoxville. Knoxville is up there next to Allentown, Belsuver, Carrick. Caught hell every day from buying that house. Finally had to let it go. What's happening today is different than what was happening back then, as my colleagues have said. There's a subtle ambience that flows out there that says, no. And no matter how many amendments they have made, because when amendments are passed in Washington or at the city, it has a hard time flowing down to the local municipalities. Somehow or another they get diluted. One municipality says it reads it this way, another reads it this way, and there's no direct course in which we all can say this is the law. J&M over there for housing, they struggle all the time with this, because what works in one part of the city and what might be constituted as something is not taking on the other side of the town, even if it's sort of right or wrong. The folks at the Human Relations Commissions, we can't even get folks to file complaints because of the fact that it takes so long for action to take place. The investigation part makes you weary. There's a long way we need to go in this, and through the help of the folks in this audience, it can be done. But it means doing a lot. It means standing up and being accountable, holding folks accountable.
Well, I'm the last one, and I'm the one that's the most nervous to answer this question. And the reason
this is a safe space, I promise.
I know it's a safe space. Just a point of reference. The Realtor Association was asked to be a part of the task force. And for a long time, the real estate profession was looked at as the problem. I'm sure that you've seen in the photographs on the video that was displayed that there were brokerages who were at the forefront of preventing people of all classes and all races of attaining the dream of home ownership. It was property managers, banks, and real estate brokers, for which was the reason that fair housing came to be, and for which fair housing has been the hammer that has come down and has required us and has convinced us that fair housing is good for everybody and it's good for business. But I will say this much, that there is still room for us to grow at the association. There are still places and pockets where we still see the type of discrimination and the type of subtle suggestion that you might not want to move into this particular neighborhood. But I will commit to telling you that the Realtor Association has a code of ethics, and we also take very strongly fair housing. And if there is a violation, we move a little bit faster than the Human Relations Commission. And if you experience discrimination, we have a method at the association, both state, national, and local, where you can take your case to, and it will be heard much faster and adjudicated much faster. So have we come a long way for realtors? Yes. Do we have room to grow and room to go? Most definitely.
Thank you. So a couple of you kind of hinted at this, and we know that, as I mentioned, as you were getting seated, that there are different levels of protections depending on the jurisdiction. Under the Fair Housing Act, there's some protections. On the Human Rights Act for the state, there's some protections. And of course, we have the city code and then the Allegheny County code that offer additional protections. But in your opinion, how the law should be different if you had the ability to influence those decision makers? What would you tell them that is crucial for the law to include as we think of not only today but of tomorrow? Who is missing from those groups that are being protected right now?
That's a good point.
Well, I don't think everybody's at the table. For me, over the years, with what I've seen, it's the enforcement and money to enforce. I mean, when you look at the budgets, especially the HUD budget that governs fair housing, for the last 20 years it's been demolished, it's been cut. It's been made to programs to fight for money against other good programs. The elderly versus the youth, public housing versus multifamily housing. So, if you do not, a law can be passed, but if there's not the funding behind to give the organizations the teeth to make sure and enforce the law, then what good is having the law? Because enforcing it is everything. We see that in many parts of our society today, enforcing the law. And if you do not have the funds or the tools to do it, then it's just a law. It's just a law.
Can I underscore the point that's being made? We have all these lawyers and professionals in real estate, advocates that have been around an extremely long time. I can't help but go back to the Urban League is 100 years old this year. And we looked, and our first housing contract that we can find was literally 7 years after the passage of the Fair Housing Act. And no matter where I am, I came in last night from Tennessee, where I was talking about the same thing around education. Identical, but around education. So when our keynote speaker started talking about housing and blended in children and education, I was like, yes! I want to get to something very basic. I'm respecting the fact that we're talking about the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act. I'm respecting the fact that laws must be passed, and I'll be an advocate to pass them. But we also need to know, I mean, they passed the Voting Rights Act. Why am I still fighting voter suppression? When we look at the United States of America, yes, we have to continue to fight and advocate and pass laws, pass additional laws that'll put teeth in it. We need to have the city, state, county, and federal government on par. But we have to deal with ourselves as people, as Americans. We have to get rid of racism.
Yes, yes.
Racism is the bottom line to all of this. How dare you think you're better than I am? I don't care what your gender or your race. That's what all of this is about. So yes, we need all the laws. We need everyone to do their part. But as individuals, we also need to step up and carry our own load about what we feel about our fellow man. There is so much that goes into this. I was reviewing the information when I saw who else was on the panel. I said, oh my God, there were pages and pages and pages of laws and amendments and adjustments, and the federal government did this, the county did this. So Pittsburgh has always been at the table. Yeah. We are still at the same place. Yeah. And so I'm saying to us, as we're hearing this conversation, let us also look at ourselves as individuals and influencers that can honestly underscore what the Fair Housing Act was supposed to do, as well as all of the other laws that we have to fight. But fair housing is critically important for all of us. And so as we look at the laws, I want you to continue to enforce them. I want you to continue to beat up people that aren't doing what they're supposed to do. But realistically, as Americans, we have to keep calling each other out, no matter the status in our government structure and in our funding structure, because so many times it is the federal government that has put things in place that keeps us from moving to A to B. And that's not accusatory, that's proven fact.
And I'm going to segue right into that. Working for the federal government, working for HUD, one of the things that we look at is accountability. So we know that there's past actions that really perpetuated discrimination throughout this country through our own actions and through our own laws. So we know when we talk about past actions, right? Some of the past actions were zoning laws that are on the books. Section 8 steering, you know, if you had a Section 8 voucher, where were you placed at in a particular community, right? Where you concentrated, where the housing voucher is just placed in community A, community B, community C, and other, what you call your upper echelon communities did not have any affordable housing in those particular communities. So communities looked different, right? And the reason that they looked different was because some of the past practices of the government. And again, local opposition. We know that there's opposition, community opposition, political opposition when you talk about what we call NIMBYism, not in my backyard, with respect to persons with disabilities. If you're trying to open up a particular group home, you have people, you know, community opposition, right? So we know that was definitely prevalent. We know there were sundown towns, right? If you were a certain color, you had to make sure you were out of a particular community by, you know, when the sun went down. Mm-hmm. So we know that there's definitely there's some permeation where the federal government, you know, has had some participation in segregation. So when you go forward today, when we talk about affirmatively furthering fair housing, right? That's been on the books since 1968. Just recently in 2016, it just gave it greater teeth with respect to putting the ownerships on particular communities, right? Each community receives some type of community planning and block grant money. Yes. That comes, you know, that particular jurisdictions receive that funding to actually help with urban development and development within a particular community. As residents and community members, right, when that money goes into your state or locality, who's at the table, right? Are you participating in citizen participation planning? Are you participating in the planning of your particular community, right? So the state localities, they must send notifications when they're actually thinking about developing a particular community. You want to make sure that you're at the table, right? You want to make sure that your political officials understand where's that money going, what does that particular community look like, what are the needs of that particular community. The residents of Pittsburgh, you know what's needed in your particular community, right? But if you're not at the table to say that we need more senior housing or we need accessible housing for persons with disability, and you leave that to others to make those decisions, if you're not at the table, what transpires, right? You're not being heard. You may not, your particular community may not look a certain way because you weren't at the table. So again, with affirmatively furthering fair housing, that's enacted where that you have to be notified. So you have some involvement in the planning of your particular community. It's akin to voting, right? If you're not at the table when they're having discussions about planning in your particular community, it's a missed opportunity. So again, its purpose to really combat past actions, right, of segregation. So again, making sure that your local advocacy groups are at the table, your fair housing organizations that really know the community needs. So that's really, again, being engaging and being at the table when they're planning a particular, you heard your last guest speaker talk about gentrification and revitalization, right? Displacement, right? So again, making sure that you're at the table when they're having those meetings and discussions.
I think that's so great a conversation. Is Paul O'Hanlon there? Paul, how long you participated in those meetings? 30 years. Craig Stevens, Rennell Guy, Bob, how many of you have participated or even found out when the meetings were? No disrespect, ma'am. We can't even find out when they are to participate. And then when we do participate, there's no record of us participating.
So I'm going to come back. That's good. This is absolutely true. So again, under affirmatively fair housing, right? Your political officials, there's something called a consolidated plan. A consolidated plan where it really lays out what each community should look like. And so in the new rule, it talks about, because we know that was an issue. A lot of you all indicated that you didn't know when the meetings were, or they had to post that information, but it was in small print in the newspaper, right? You may have missed it, correct? Or the meetings were held at a time that wasn't advantageous for particular individuals, right? Or was it accessible? So right now, under that guidance, it mandates, HUD says, that if you're holding these meetings, you must notify so many days in advance. It must be a certain size. It must be advertised in various newspapers, right? Because we're talking about all inclusive. So was it just in the Pittsburgh Post? In the Pittsburgh Post? Was it in other newspapers? So again, the department is really looking at really making sure that past actions of discrimination and people are really being notified. So again, we know that has occurred, but our position is we have to address that, and it's mandated that, again, if there's public meetings, you should be notified. If you're participating in a public meeting, it should be on the record. It should be recorded. If you're voicing your opinion about the needs of a particular community, it's mandated that it must be recorded, and your comments must be included in the community engagement piece with respect to planning.
Thank you.
So, those are very, very valid points. And I have to tell you, since I became director of the commission, that has been one of my personal missions, is to make sure that those notices are known to the people that need to know them. Because again, if it's in small print, and it can be in 10 different newspapers, but if the print is so tiny that you need the Hubble telescope to be able to read it. It doesn't do anyone any good. So my personal mission has been, since I started 2 years ago, that whenever we become aware, we share that information with everyone that is on our distribution list, whether they are affected by the meeting itself or not, whether it's in a different part of the city. I don't care. You're going to get some information from us saying this is happening. And if you can attend, call your neighbors, call your friends, make sure that your voices are heard. Because that was one of the first things that I heard when I became director. Like, we have been at the table. We have tried to be at the table, but number one, sometimes we don't know where the table is. And sometimes, even when we're at the table, we are ignored. So I have made it my personal mission again to try to be as inclusive and as open as we can with the process, encouraging everyone to participate, even if they feel it's not relevant to them at that particular time. Come, because it is important for all of us to hear what your concerns are. And if you told me your concern yesterday, I want you to tell it to me again today, because there might be a new person at that table who needs to hear that. And I do not want to speak for anyone, because all of us have a voice. So it's really important that we remember that. Will anyone else care to add anything to the conversation before we move on to the next question?
I'm just going to pitch one thing that when we're talking about engaging and the idea that our elected officials and those in power don't always hear what we're saying or hear what we want. I want to put a plug in for the community feedback that we're going to be going out into the community and asking for community feedback, because the feedback that we get from you is the feedback that we're going to take back, and we are going to make sure that those that make the decisions are held accountable. And the word accountability is so important, because a lot of times, and I've heard this over and over again, well, I've been studied and I've been analyzed and I've had reports done, and I've never seen any of the product of what those reports are. Mm-hmm. This is a whole different, I don't know whether the planets have aligned and suddenly, maybe it's the 50th anniversary, maybe it's the current administration, whatever it is, it's time for you out there to become engaged. And please, we will make sure that you all know when those engagements are, so that everybody can come to the table and make your feelings and your concerns known.
And one other piece to that, we are purposely taking months to make this happen. So this is not going to be bold. We're going to have a meeting next Tuesday at 2 p.m. downtown, and that's going to be your opportunity to speak. We're going to provide many opportunities for you, for your friends, for your family members, your neighbors, the person you worship next to, for them to be able to provide feedback in person, in writing, through interviews, and very many different formats, because it is important for those voices who have been silenced to finally be heard. And it's my commitment that we're going to do everything that we can to provide opportunities for those voices to be included. So, absolutely.
When? I just said thank you. Thank you. When is the next one?
So the first meeting is going to be on May 19th, starting at 11:30 a.m. Lunch will be provided. Lunch will be, there should be flyers available in the tables up front. But if you want to know, please see me before we leave today, and I will make sure that you have the information. But the first meeting is going to be May 19th at 1 Smithfield. Lunch will be provided, childcare will be provided, there's parking, so we encourage you to join us.
And I would say that over the last 20 years, it's been 1,000 rooms, 1,000 meetings. We continue to come up with plans, this task force, that task force. We continue to talk, but ain't nobody doing nothing. We continue to talk about best practice. We continue to come up with the exact same best practices that we came up 15 years ago. Ain't nothing new. These are things that we need to do. There's not the political will or the resources to do that. I mean, we've had so many housing plans and so many plans that, you know, we could probably compile them and it's bigger than a Bible. But I'm just saying, when's the implementation? Like, I'm tired of sitting at tables, I'm tired of talking about it. Nobody's doing their job. I mean, people are being evicted in huge numbers. I wonder how many of those missing, when he said we're actually losing houses in our neighborhood, how many of them houses was demolished by housing authorities? And who do we hold accountable for the destruction of our neighborhoods and our communities? How do we enforce? The laws are lovely. How do we enforce it? I forgot a question I got for
And we're going to have a portion where we're going to allow questions from the audience. And please, so don't leave for now. I'm going to keep an eye on you. But we're going to allow an opportunity for the audience to ask questions of our panelists. So this question may be a little tricky, but I wonder what your opinions are in the matter. And so, in your opinion, do you think that diversity or lack thereof has contributed or played a role in segregation?
Yes. Yes. Let's begin with redlining.
We can go back to the 1937 map, right?
Yeah. Diversity.
There it is.
Played a role in segregation.
Again, you can begin with redlining. And really, the sister is underscoring the statement I was trying to make at the beginning. I am a civil rights advocate. I will always be at the table. Everybody up here is trying to do, I believe, a good job from where they sit. I am so glad you're with the federal government. And I'm not just saying that. I'm not just saying that. I'm being very serious, because we have to be everywhere in order to make the movements that we have been able to make with some gains, even though you have to stay at the table. But ghettos were created by redlining.
Yeah.
The segregation was a part of housing. If you look back to FDR's plan, if you look back, I mean, again, she can give you the dates and the names of the laws that desegregated us, that said you can live in Homewood, but you can't live in Squirrel Hill. All of these things are very real, and it's a part of America. And that's why don't take what I'm saying lightly about we have to change individually so we can change our institutions and not constantly just tweak them. You are going to get a list of, I can show you back in my notes, at least 20 laws. The dates, the names, what they were supposed to do. 5 years later, here's how we tweaked this one.
Yep.
That didn't work, it didn't cover this. Oh, we got to add to the people now. Okay, it's not just race. Let's add sexual origin. Let's do the. We, as a people, as a community, as a country, as Americans, we have to make it better. But yes, desegregation exists because of the very conversation we're having now. Redlining was, when I look back in the Urban League's history, some of the first things the Urban League did was testing. And we were very good at it. We could put a real light-skinned black with a dark-skinned black, or with a white person, or with a single female head of household, or with a male head of household, but he'd been laid off now and then. You know, I mean, when we look at all of these things, it's real about America and who we are. And unfortunately, we are going to have to continue to come to the table to make the changes and to fight for what we know is right. And it's not just the people with titles, it's each and every one of you. And you can't get no ways tired.
If I could just tail end on that, and this goes to Barbara over there with regard to the federal government and how these things work. We're talking about 50 years, and actually the time following the Second World War, where these veterans came back from their service with benefits. These benefits would allow them to buy a home, right, and they were stopped in terms of their ability to make that happen. That's what these types of things eventually led to the creation of the Human Relations Commission in the early 1950s and the passage of that law a few years later. With regard to HUD, from the passage of this law, every 10 years there's a census, okay? And HUD studies, every 10 years they do what they call an HDS study, Housing Discrimination Study. And based on that study, they make adjustments. So thank God they're not static and not making adjustments. With regard to public housing policy, I think anyone that's been around for a while knows how it's changed. Public housing policy were these large projects on a remote hilltop somewhere where people were very limited in terms of access to places of employment, access to food stores, things of that nature. Okay? HUD recognized this is not a workable model. They've made changes. But this stuff takes a long time. And I know people are frustrated with the time this stuff takes, but it really takes a long time, a lifetime, basically. And one other point I wanted to make was they've made changes in the Section 8 program. It used to be limited. There was a certain amount of money that you got, and they had to work anywhere in the city. Now they have a certain amount depending upon the zip code you're in. So you can take that voucher if you can find a place and make it work. But at least they weren't static. They recognized these things and they tried to make adjustments. Unfortunately, these adjustments always occur after the fact. They can't see into the future and see what's going to happen. They try, and what their purpose was, I really don't know. I can't go back to 1950 or 1947 or anything like that. When they created these public housing projects like Terrace Village, my brother lived there one time, and I thought it was beautiful, but be that as it may, it truly was, and it had beautiful people in it.
Absolutely.
But it wasn't intended to be long-term housing. Never was. But the communities, the government, the local, state, encouraged people to take pride in their communities. And when they did, and they said to them, well, we're going to have to move you from here. You know, that's what happens. But this is a long story. We're not going to cover it in an afternoon.
But the thing about it is what Charles is alluding to. I'm a proud resident of public housing, proud of it. Rose Street, Francis Street, Whiteside Road, you name it.
There you go.
I'm a proud resident. And those were built when they tore down the lower hill.
Yeah.
When they tore, and 8,000 folks, not only black folks, but Italians, Russians, Jews, and others, got displaced out of the lower hill. And those were the place. How many people remember when Northview Estates was the place to be? When St. Clair Village, you couldn't get in.
Yeah.
You couldn't get in there now. Now it's just a memory.
Yeah, it's true.
St. Clair Village is just a memory.
Yeah, I know.
Borough Street, just a memory. They placed it with the new mixed income neighborhoods. You tear down 700 families for poor folks, and you build back, but you only build 400 for the people you displaced. Right. Therefore, leaving 300 to go wherever they might be.
Right.
So policies that have been created have also been harmful. And what they were intended to do, to create something new, but in essence, they created something that didn't work. I'm not going to say worse, I'm saying it just didn't work. It didn't work. And to that point, where we are, because as Chuck said, you can get a voucher now. Yes, the Housing Authority is thinking about increasing the value in certain zip codes for where you can take it. But again, that subtle nuance that they don't have to take it.
No.
This is a private landlord, folks. If he don't want to take it, he don't have to take it.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? So you can increase the payment standards if you want, but as the Housing Alliance and others who I have been a part of for a long time to say, it's supply and demand. We don't have enough. Can you remember them when they tore down all the single room occupancy around by the stadium, down in the Strip District? All these houses for people, individuals. Now they're building all these fancy apartments that are not built for families. My wife went and looked at one the other day. They wanted $13,000 a month. She couldn't even put her coat in the closet.
Right, so small.
That's your classmate, Esther. That's your classmate. And so there you are. And so we live in an area that is slowly turning. Rents in our neighborhood are jumping dramatically. So the amount that people are being asked to pay for rent is far exceeding what they are making if they can find a job. So you have a number of different policies and other things, Esther said, with education, transportation, healthcare, everything now drooling that, which do I do? Which I was so glad when she said she was talking about the education piece. Because you have to connect it.
Well, it's all connected.
It's all connected. It's all connected.
It's all connected. Yeah.
And so you need to do, and so when you looked and the young gentleman did the presentation, I was very impressed by his presentation. The data drives folks, and Esther knows data more than others because she uses it a lot. Data, I can't understand it. I just know what's real. They just took me and they moved me from there, and they moved me from there, and then they sent me over there, and they told me I was poor, but I didn't know I was poor. So I don't know all that. You understand me? But I appreciate the data. Because for folks like Esther who can translate it and help me to understand what it means is what I need. And so I appreciate that. Ms. Barber, I heard good things about you from Mr. Jim Bowles. He told me to tell you hi. He told me to tell you hi. Allegheny County Housing Authority, he told me to tell you hi. That's a son. I said, gee whiz. So, but it's things, and when you have her agency, and it's not her, it's the agency.
Sure.
And they have come out with some discouraging remarks in the last couple of weeks about what their direction is going.
And putting things on hold.
And putting stuff on hold. We can no longer sit there and just say, hey, Esther said it on the bush. It's not us. It's not about us. It's about you. It's about you standing up, being accountable, and taking grasp for what you can control and for what you can do. Because I'm so happy to have known so many of you in this audience today that it's unbelievable. And knowing some people up on the stage and meeting some new folks, even though he's a realtor, it's all right. It's all right. He's okay. He's okay. He's all right.
That's right.
He's all right. He's all right. We ain't going to beat him up today. But again, it's good because we have to have this dialogue. We have to have this open piece of conversation. So, to that point.
And I just speak to also, in addition to, so absolutely, the department, when you talked about putting things on hold, one thing that I can say the department is doing is again the department HUD has recognized, again we're talking about past practices that created segregation. So we know that years ago, or not even years ago, communities look different. Where the money was being placed in one particular community, when I talk about community CDBG funds, right? And so we know there was a time where, again, I'm going to keep going back to, segregated housing or concentrated affordable housing or low-income housing in one area versus another area. And in that particular community, where more than likely it was a community of color, you had concentrated housing of low-income housing, but also in those communities, what was not there was access to goods and services, and that's key. So when you talk about access to goods and services, you had communities that had affordable housing, but there was no transportation, right? When you talk about the quality of grocery stores, right? In some communities, there wasn't even a grocery store that was in walking distance, right? Or the quality of that particular the quality of that particular grocery store in that community, right? And so again, when you talk about access, housing is you know, if you don't have access or affordable housing, you can't get to a particular, you know, you can't get to employment if there's no transportation, right? Your children are going to grow up, you know, malnourished because they don't have access to quality foods, right? Quality stores, right? So again, moving fast forward, one of the things that the department is doing is saying this can no longer exist. And so again, when you have, again, community development, you have to really understand what's being built in your community. So if you have a particular community where there's development going on and it's a low-income community, that particular community must have quality stores, right? It must be near transportation. So if you're building a particular community, it can no longer, you just can't build a community and just say, here's some affordable housing and not give those particular communities access to goods and services. So when we talk about, you're going to hear the buzzword for HUD, housing opportunities, right? Higher opportunities. For housing, right? Is this a higher opportunity community? And so those higher opportunities communities should look the same across the nation, right? So if you have a community, you're talking about a community in Homewood, right? Does that community in Homewood look like the community in Shadyside, right? So again, I'm encouraging you to make sure that you're at the table, so you're having those discussions with your politicals, right? So they understand, right, that, you know, if you're bringing developers in to this particular community, and it's mandated through HUD that they must, you know, your communities must mirror each other. It's no longer where community, because it's a low-income community, looks like it doesn't have access to goods and services. It must look like, you know, all communities across, you know, the nation. Again, one community looking like another community. Again, when we're talking about equal access, right, for all. When we're talking about community and housing, we're just not talking about that housing stock. We're talking about the access and the resources, right, that are in that particular community.
And for those of us that are working in the field of fair housing, that is at the forefront of everything we think about and everything that we do. Neighborhoods of opportunity, and if the opportunities are not in that neighborhood, some people may think, well, we need to move the people out of the neighborhood. No. We don't need to move the people out of the neighborhood. We need to bring those opportunities into the neighborhood.
And we talked a little bit about displacement, right? So again, just learned best practices. Years ago, when individuals were building housing, affordable housing, public housing stock, we know people were displaced, right? And so they only built a certain amount of units, and then maybe it was 400 units, now it's down to 200 units, right? So HUD has learned from that. It's like, so now it's mandated if there's affordable housing and their housing stock is being demolished and rebuilt, it must be rebuilt, you know, to make sure that everyone can either come back to that particular community, that individuals aren't displaced. So again, that information is out there. So housing authorities, again, they're aligned with, you know, HUD to say that if in fact it's mandated under the Fair Housing Act, you have to make sure that if you're building affordable housing and you're demolishing housing, certain actions must make sure that they, you know, that certain actions must occur. Displacement, individuals must be able to return, or giving a voucher where they can go to a particular community of their choice. Again, when we're talking about familial status, we know that's something that's being mandated right now. So you see a lot of housing development that's being built. And so, say for instance, you have someone that says, okay, we're tearing down this community and we're building 400 units, and all 400 units are one bedrooms, right? So what does that tell you? That tells you that families with children are not going to be able to move in this particular community. So again, when you're having those discussions before that development is built, right, you're at the table saying, you know what? That's not going to work in our particular community because we need units that have 3 or 4 bedrooms, right? We don't need a building that only has 1 bedroom units in that particular development. So again, that's what we're talking about, being at the table, making sure that you're, you know, being heard, your political, your councilmen, you know, your council persons in your community, making sure you're having those conversations, because you can develop your community. You know what the needs of your particular community are.
And one thing that, for those of us who have paid attention to national issues, we know that voting counts. It is imperative for all of us who are able to not only register to vote, but exercise that right, because it is a right and many people fought to make sure that all of us had that same right. So for those of us that, again, it is essential that we participate in that process. And it doesn't matter whether we agree on the political party or the individual candidate, but we need to exercise that right.
I agree.
I'm just going to bank off of that because I don't know if in the news lately, and give you an example, they asked Mr. Bill Gates how much a quart of milk was, and he couldn't say how much a quart of milk was. If you listen to the Zuckerberg hearings yesterday at all, there were senators who just didn't understand what the internet was. Now, the reason why I'm saying that is because these are the people who are making laws. These are the people who are deciding what policy is. And if they can't relate to the internet, and they can't relate to you, and they can't relate to the issues that are important to you, so it is so critical. It is so critical to get out and vote and to be informed. Being informed and vote people who relate to you. Because I heard another congressman say, well, you know, I was able to put myself through college. And I said, well, when was that? On a part-time job. He goes, oh, that was like 1952. I said, well, I don't know about now, but you can't work at a McDonald's and put yourself through college. No. So again, it's the relatability of it. So please make sure that who you vote for represents you.
So for our panelists, I'm going to ask you to be future tellers. And I'm going to ask you before we take a break, what do you think we're going to be 50 years from now in fair housing?
There won't be none.
Oh, because discrimination will be gone, right? Is that why? No, but...
You all be in New Jersey. You know, after the escape from New York, everybody that's poor is going to be put in New Jersey. And then the rest of them will have the country. That's what's going to happen over the next few years.
So where do you think we're going to be in 50 years, fair housing? Well, we will be dead. Most of us will probably be dead, right? But there will be other people.
I think there's a trend of interracial relationships and marriages at higher levels than at any time in the past. I think it's a trend that's likely to continue. How that impacts the fair housing picture, I really can't say 50 years from now, but I think that's something that you'll see in the future. Ideally, there wouldn't be a need if everything went well, but I don't think that's going to happen. There may even be some additional protected classes then, who knows?
I would think more likely.
Yeah, you know, we may have robots as our assistants, or instead of an assistive animal or something like, we have an assistive robot. But I really don't know. I hope that, I mean, there's been progress over the last 50 years, and I think that the changes that have been made have hastened the progress. Changes I'm talking about are in terms of the enforcement mechanisms, putting the teeth in the law, a more aggressive approach to housing discrimination, approach that punishes those people that violate the law in a way that they will never violate that law again. You know, I think there'll be those changes will move this thing in the right direction, but I don't think we'll totally eliminate the problem of housing discrimination.
I think that all of us have to, let me say, there's absolutely hope. There will absolutely be more progressive change.
Yeah.
I believe many of you might not know that the greater Pittsburgh area is one of the places in the country where interracial marriages is going up. And so all of these things will be helpful. It's just like I didn't think I would see a black president of the United States in my lifetime. I honestly didn't think that would happen. And I'm so proud that it did. And President Obama was elected for 2 terms. I am one of those people that I believe you have to be consistent, you have to agitate, you have to accept the good that comes out of great efforts, but you also have to be persistent and be a constructive agitator. None of us can get tired. All of us have to keep moving. I think fair housing, we're going to see it make progress, and we're going to see that we're still going to need new laws to cover those loopholes that the previous new laws didn't cover. And that's just the way it is in America. That's just the way it is. And so the frustration is good. The advocacy is good. The why wasn't I included is good. That is going to keep America moving. We have to continue to hold city, county, state, federal, we have to hold everybody accountable. We have to ask our elected officials more intensive questions about things that you care about. And we are going to continue to make change. I see it getting a little bit better, but I don't see me being satisfied.
I would agree. I'm very hopeful that within the next 50 years that we're going to see continued advocacy. We're going to see more, the department's hope is that we see more people on the ground really being involved in that community engagement piece, having those conversations, being at the table. It really is a movement, and so if you don't have individuals at the table, your advocacy groups then it can go awry. But more importantly, even though in some instances there's funding cut for fair housing, we know that occurs. But at the end of the day, that what has been consistent and that cannot change is the Fair Housing Act is a law. Okay, so it is a law. So even though we may have money, the decrease in funding may occur. If you file a complaint, right, under the Fair Housing Act, the department is mandated to investigate that complaint in 100 days, okay? Because we want to provide redress to individuals swiftly. Does it always happen? Absolutely not. But that's a goal of the department, to investigate a complaint within 100 days to find, if there was discrimination occurred or not, and to provide some remedies for individuals that file a complaint. And so again, making sure that the word is out there, that you have, that you know where to go to file a complaint. Because in this effort at the department, one thing that I always like to tell people when we talk about HUD, everybody in here understands when they hear HUD, you know about what? Public and Indian housing, correct? Right? Most people know when you ask about housing, the first thing they're going to say is, public, Section 8 or community block grant. But you really have to really get engaged and understand that I am the enforcement arm of the department, right? And so the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity is a key player at HUD. All right, and so we're the, so again, if individuals violate, if you go to, if you believe you've been discriminated with respect to housing, and it's through your public and Indian office, you will come to our office because you filed a complaint. So again, that's not going to change. We're there. So I said we're the enforcement arm. You really should get to know the fair housing arm within the department, because that's the action of HUD if we believe that a person has been discriminated against. So again, 50 years from now, that law is still going to be on the books. Will it be fully funded? Probably not. But the enforcement mechanism is there.
50 years from now, I'm not going to be in the majority.
Yeah.
50 years from now, people of color, African Americans, Hispanics, are going to be the majority. That gives me hope. But what also gives me hope is that this current year there are more women running for seats in Congress than ever before. What gives me hope 50 years from now is that there's a potential that Congress just might change this year. Those are the things that give me hope. But the biggest hope I have is that each one of you in this room, because my generation, the baby boomers, we're on our way out, but it's the millennial generation and the generations after. You guys have really stepped up to the plate already. I can't wait to see what you do in the next 25 years.
Great. So we are going to take a 30-minute break. There are some snacks out in the same area where the lunch was. We're going to come back at 3:30, and we're going to allow the audience to ask questions of our panelists. This is the part of the afternoon in which we are going to allow the public to ask questions of our panelists. But before we start, I want to encourage everyone, in your blue bags, there's a flyer for an event on April 24th. It's titled Housing as a Human Right, and is being organized by Jackie Smith with the University of Pittsburgh and the Human Rights Alliance. So the flyer is in your blue bag. If you're able, please join us that day as we talk to these panelists about this important issue. Also, before we get started, I asked former Director Morris if he would tell us about the one housing investigation under his tenure. Well, no, let me finish. Under his tenure that had a significant penalty associated with it.
Young woman became employed with a large rental company in Shadyside. The name of the company was National Apartment Leasing Company. And they had over 1,000 units in the East End. The young woman, when she became employed there, found herself being trained in how to detect a black dialect and what to do when she detected a black dialect from the people who called to inquire about the apartments that were being advertised. She was told to screen out those who she found had this black dialect. And she was taught, detail, bedroom. They say bedroom, that high likelihood that's an African American. So anyway, she contacted first the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, and then later our commission, Pittsburgh Commission. We jumped right on it. I was fortunate enough to have with me on my staff my colleague and good friend and partner, Yancey Miles, who is an acquaintance, I think, of Esther Bush here. Yancey Miles, an extremely dedicated, hardworking person. Yancey and I began the process of putting this case together. Yancey is our principal investigator. I was in the role of compliance supervisor at the time. And this young woman would provide us documentary evidence, and it it was such that it was an elaborate scheme. And it goes back, there was a prior incident, several prior cases filed against Nalco, one in which I went out to their office to investigate, and I was going to review documents at their office, and the person who was the head of that organization said, sure, you can come out and look at the documents. Certainly the commission has the right to do that, and I get there, and he says, we can't find the key for the file cabinet.
Oh my.
Well, that's par for the course in the civil rights field, okay? There's always barriers. It doesn't matter whether I'm white or black. I'm a representative of the Human Relations Commission, so it doesn't matter. But I'm not getting at the records. So I said to him, well, I said, there's a locksmith I know that's not far from here. And I said, I can get him here in probably about 15, 20 minutes. So this man picked up the phone and called the mayor. At that time, we were part of the mayor's office. It was the Mayor's Commission on Human Relations, which with the passage of the Home Rule Charter became an independent part of Pittsburgh City Government, the Pittsburgh Commission on Human Relations. But at that time, we were part of the mayor's office, and I was called down to the mayor's office and asked to explain myself. Fortunately, like James Comey, I took copious notes. and I always felt, working for the commission, because it can be challenging, because there's people who'll threaten you, they'll get in your face and everything else. I always felt if I'm doing the right thing, I have power. They can't touch me, they can't hurt me. And if they hurt me, I'll be a hero. So that's the way I felt. I came at it that way. But I was always trying to be fair and understanding I'm representing this honorable commission. And we couldn't get anywhere with that case. And I'll tell you why. The documents that the young woman sent to us, she explained to us how these documents were created. And on the documents, they had things on top. And one said show, okay? So if they circled show, that meant that the person was black. But when the investigator came and said, I want to see the records for this person, well, we tried to show it to him. Look, we circled show. He didn't show up. That's what we ran into. But this case went forward. Through the course of the document review, we were able to identify 7 or 8 other persons who had been harmed, one of which was a HUD official, a local HUD official. None of these people knew that they had been discriminated against, none of them, until we contacted them and had a little chat with them. Each of them filed a complaint. Each of them went to federal court with it. The commission initiated its own complaint, and we, without having to go to trial, the case is settled. And the commission received, in terms of a civil penalty, $225,000, which we used to further the mission of the agency. So it was at that time, and may still be, the largest case in Pennsylvania, at least of that nature. But there were many, many other cases. And fortunately, as we talked about, there were penalties put into the law where you can recover. And we always look to try to support the ongoing work of the commission wherever we could in terms of the recovery of any money. Use it to do education and outreach. Use it to do enforcement. We would encourage the city to contract with the FHP to do testing. Testing is a valuable tool for us. So there
Still today.
Well, it still is. These housing discrimination complaints would initially appear to be easy. You know, you applied, you were qualified, you were rejected, but it's not that easy. You have to show that the rejection was because of the person's race or disability or family status or something like that. And unless they admit it, You have to go a roundabout route to prove it. And we were successful in many instances of doing that. But that case was certainly a landmark case and put us on the map, at least for that period of time, in terms of our work in the area of fair housing enforcement.
Great, thank you. And I just wanted the audience to hear that one story, because I certainly was aware of it, but I don't think that many people in the community knew about how elaborate and the length that they went to engage in that kind of practice.
It was well thought out. It was intentional. And I mean, to get to the point where you train your agents to detect the dialect, my God.
Yeah,
you know.
it's very difficult.
And then after our case, he hired a black receptionist.
Well, of course, because, see, we don't discriminate. We have a person of color working here. So
exactly.
So now is an opportunity for audience members, and we have 2 microphones that we have available for questions. So ask away.
See somebody there. Oh, good.
My question is for Mr. Morrison. That practice that you just talked about just a moment ago, in the foreseeable future, have you seen that same practice still going on right now today?
They made changes, and see what things have changed so much because, in essence, the internet, the access to the rental listings was primarily in the daily papers here in Pittsburgh, the Post-Gazette, Pittsburgh Press, and Post-Gazette when they were both out there. So, everybody would look at the ads, and we looked at the ads too. We checked the ads to make sure there wasn't any sort of little coding in there, and especially when they passed a law about familial status, no children, but the internet's changed everything. Those people in that case changed their practices and changed their name. But they changed their practices, and what they did was they changed their practices to accept everyone. You give me the money right now, and if we pass you, you're accepted. So they accepted, they take your money, and you're accepted until you pass that. We're accepting you. You're going to sign a lease, so you're locked in. So in terms of sending a tester out there, we were done. We wanted to follow up with them and test them, but they said we rent to everyone. We have everyone sign a lease. We take money from everybody, and we do a credit check. And if they pass, we sign a lease, and it's a done deal. So that they made it very, very difficult for us to come back around and check on them. But we did what we could. Was we did. I don't want to call it a stakeout, but what we did was we watched the building. We talked to people in the neighborhood. Hey, do you live around here? You know anything about this building? Anybody in there? Any people of color in that building? Right? We would do stuff like that. We would go out and hang out in the street and talk to people. Because that's how sometimes it has to be. Mm-hmm. And you can't be out there like suit and tie like George, I had one landlord I was trying to subpoena, and the guy kept dodging me. So one day I had my dog and some shorts on and a t-shirt, and I'm walking along, and I walked up into the office, and I said, "Hey, is Jerry here?" "Oh yeah, Jerry's here. Hey, tell him Charlie's out here." And he comes out, he said, "I don't know you." I said, "You're subpoenaed." So we had to do all kinds of things to get it done.
Yeah.
But we did it.
And last year, last year we investigated that same landlord for familial status.
Okay. Interesting. For what?
Familial status.
Oh, familial status, yeah.
Yeah. So, we found cause.
We had one against them familial status too.
And we found cause, and we had our partners, our FHP, help us on testing.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So, I'm Jade Warren, the Executive Director of the Fair Housing Partnership. So I could give you about 20 questions, but I'm going to try and limit this down a little bit. To begin with, let me just first say, I'm really glad to see that this was put together. As the only fair housing advocacy, that's all we do is advocate on behalf of victims of housing discrimination. We know how difficult it is to get a seat at the table. Having said that, I think that there was the initial statement about where we are 50 years. I want to make one quick comment and then I'll move on to my question. My quick comment is, tomorrow we'll be filing another case of another time when another housing provider told a black resident that it wasn't available one more time. And again, we do the testing, and Esther, to your point, you were exceptionally good at testing. In fact, you were so good at testing that the CHURB split off and became the Fair Housing Partnership. So we thank the Urban League for our existence. But you know, the testing once again shows that outcome. So where are we 50 years from now? Well, 50 years to the day, we have one more case of racial discrimination. 50 years to the day, to the point of Mr. Dean, we have one more real estate agent that contacted us to tell us that when their person made a full price offer, right, and when they found out that they were black, that they said, oh, we already have another one that we're in consideration. And they moved on and took that other person, even though there was a text of a full price offer available. So where are we 50 years from now? We're at the same place that we were, that a person can't rent because they're black, a person can't buy because they're black. Where will we be 50 years from now? You know, I don't know, but we have to be honest about where we are. Having said that, a couple of really quick questions. I'm going to put them out there, and anyone from the panel can feel free to answer. The first is that the keynote speaker talked about gentrification and the impact of gentrification. I'm interested to hear, and I know I've heard from previous HUD folks, so I'm interested to hear from everyone though. Isn't the answer there, or what do you think in terms of ensuring one-to-one replacement and build first policies when you move into areas? So to give you an idea, they showed you everything about East Liberty, right? And you know, we all know that when you saw that movement of the population, that movement of the population was a result of destroying public housing and not replacing it with the same number of affordable units. So if we're actually looking at gentrification that's going to benefit the people who are living there at the time, you know, if you could comment on making sure that for every public affordable housing that you destroy, you build one first, and then you transfer that person into that unit if they want to be there. My second question, very quickly, is in relation to the enforcement that we do. We are fortunate enough to be the partners of HUD who make sure that we are able to do our testing work. I'd like to know from any of the kind of non-HUD people, so I already know Barbara's position, where you feel the benefits of testing have been and what we can do to strengthen it. And then my last question, this is what happens when a fair housing advocate is sitting at the table or sitting in the crowd. We had a lot of questions. My last question, specifically, Mr. Dean, I know you spoke about an internal process in terms of enforcement. As somebody who regularly deals with fair housing enforcement, I'd be interested to know both what that process is, what are the potential penalties, and how does the public know when a real estate agent who has violated the act has done so? And I've got more, but I'll leave it there for now.
Who do you want to,
You can answer as you wish.
I'll try to answer that in sequential order if I can remember everything. Every realtor has to sign a pledge, and part of the pledge is a fair housing pledge. And that pledge stipulates that there are 16 things or 16 segments of things that they have to recognize that they understand that they cannot do. On top of that, they also pledge to a Realtor Code of Ethics, which is about 100 years old right now. That code also governs internal behavior amongst real estate professionals landlords, sellers, and listers alike. There's two processes that can happen. One is an internal process where, for instance, if the person that was attempting to buy a house, excuse me, felt that they were discriminated against, they can actually file a claim within the Realtor Association. Our professional standards committee would then refer it to the board of directors. The board of directors would then hold a hearing. And the hearing could either be between the professional standards committee or between an arbitrator or a mediator, whichever one they choose, funded and paid for by the Realtor Association. The results of that are final in most instances, unless, of course, they're neither adjudicated by a mediator. And then there's a penalty. And the fines can range anywhere from $200 to $10,000. And there's record of that. You can actually go online and find record of that within the association. But more importantly, if somebody wants to take even a higher step, they can take the case all the way to the Real Estate Commission. Yeah. And that's a body that no realtor ever wants to have come in their office. Because what happens with it is, it's the classic case where they go in and they're there for one particular reason, and suddenly they find all this other stuff that's been going on, and suddenly it blossoms into something quite large. The penalties for that can go into the 6 figures, loss of license, loss of brokerage. There is a lot of penalties out there that hold realtors accountable and honest, and the documentation requirement is so immense that if realtors don't walk out of a closing with a file that's this thick, something's wrong. So I hope that kind of, there was any part of that I didn't answer that I don't remember, because I'm a little older and I don't.
Jay, you asked a question about testing, and without question, the testing evidence is essential in these investigations. You know, before there were testing programs, it would be something like, Esther or Barbara would say, you know, I just called a place. We had a case, to give you an example, we had a case out in Oakland where an African-American woman called to inquire about a house that was for rent. And they were very welcoming over the phone. She went out and looked at it, and they gave her a price. They told her, now this is a few years back, they told her it was $900 a month. So she said, okay. And she went back to her office, and she's speaking with one of her white coworkers. And she said, you know, I just looked at this house. They told me $900 a month. Seems kind of high to me. She said, and her coworker said, it sounds high to me too. She said, would you mind calling out there and see what they tell you? So her coworker calls, and they said, oh, well, we're not giving the price over the phone. We want you to come out and see it. So she said, well, okay, I'll be out after work. I'll take a look. So she went by, and they told her $700. So we found that there was a black rent and a white rent, so to speak, a difference in the terms. And that was that on that case. That was the response name was DeFelice. We ended up having to go to get the sheriff of Allegheny County to execute the commission's order. They went to their house. The sheriff went to their house and said, we're going to start taking your furniture. We're going to have a sheriff's sale. We're going to sell your house. They said, hold on, we'll get the money. Give us an hour. We'll go to the bank. So that's how that went. You know, they fight you all the way. All the way they fight you until they know they can't get out. But, you know, that's the nature of what we're dealing with. But that was an informal test. But the testing done by organizations like the FHP, the testers are well trained, and when you end up in a trial, they question the training of the testers. They question them about any bias they may have. So they have to be squeaky clean Squeaky clean, not come in there with any preconceived notions or bias. Squeaky clean. They check them, they look for any hole in the fence to try to get out of these things. But with the testing evidence, there aren't too many holes in the fence. So that evidence is good. It's an invaluable tool, and keep up the good work, Jay.
Yes, sir.
My name is Richard Edmonds, and this question is primarily to Barbara, but anyone on the panel can answer as well. In regards to earlier statement made about fair housing, but human rights. Now, with the unproportional or disproportional number of minorities in housing projects that are being shot and things of that sort, getting to the point where it's with police accountability in regards to so much on the news, a police officer shoots somebody and they get away with it. I was just wondering, in regards to fair housing and the whole concept of regentrification and gentrification, how fair is the housing is when, you know, if somebody, the death rates are so high and no accountability, if that's not too far fetched.
So, human rights, I totally agree. I understand that there's a lot of crime, violence, things that occur in particular housing projects. For instance, murders, things of that nature. That's really not under our purview with respect to crime and violence. We know that it occurs. That definitely is a human rights issue. That's again, the matter, you know, doesn't fall under our jurisdiction per se when it comes to violence and safety. However, it falls under our purview, again, when we look at the overall housing stock and we determine that, again, when it goes back to a concentrated area, where concentrated area of poverty, where there's only housing, where there's low-income housing in one particular area, versus there's no housing stock in an area that's affluent. So we look at it from that perspective, and we say it looks like there's a disproportionate amount of individuals of color that are in this particular community. It's not thriving, whereas when we compare other communities where there's no low-income housing, and so we're looking at the overall community to see if there is a disparate impact or disparity in services as it respects to the overall housing, but the crime and violence doesn't really fall under our purview. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, but I was thinking, since you are a federal agency, and even here in Pittsburgh, we've had some headlining stories where it's taken 2 or 3 years for justice to be served, and I would think if it's supposed to be fair housing, if the crime rate, the murder rate is so high, I think it could be addressed or should be addressed, but that's just my feeling on it.
Right. And I understand what you're saying. So under the Fair Housing Act, right, we really look at a protected category, right? And so the 7 protected categories are if someone's been discriminated in their housing based on their race, based on their religion, their sex, right? Those are areas that we look at. Safety and crime does not fall under protected class under the Fair Housing Act. So directly, we can't address crime in a particular community because it doesn't fall under one of our protected classes. But how in some instances, again, we look at the community itself to see if that particular community is a community of color. If it deals with familial status where children are being violated, but again, it has to fall in the context of that particular housing. So this crime and safety issue doesn't really fall under our purview.
Okay, I was just thinking of it.
But I understand what you're saying, it's not fair. And so a lot of times that's what we get. We get calls all the time because the acronym is the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. And so a lot of people will call and they say to us, you know what, I've been on the waiting list for a housing voucher for 10 years. It's not fair. And I have to say, I understand what you're saying, we hear you, but that doesn't fall under our purview because the waiting list is associated with the housing authority. But however, if the person says, I have been on the waiting list for 10 years and I'm disabled and I feel like I've been discriminated against and I haven't received housing because I'm disabled, then that would fall under our purview because disability is a protected class.
Okay. Can I just say one more thing?
Yes.
Now, housing authorities, from my understanding, they have their own police force. Well, I know in Pittsburgh at one point there was a housing authority police force. So that's why I was tying into, whereas if it was a housing authority police with the Pittsburgh police or whatever jurisdiction, some kind of something forceful method or could be made. But that's my whole thought on it. Thank you.
When I think, before you go, Jay's never, you didn't get your first question answered, I believe, Jay, right? As it related to
the one-on-one,
the gender and the one-for-one.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's backtrack a minute. The Housing Authority, I'm only speaking about the Housing Authority, City of Pittsburgh.
Right.
Housing Authority, City of Pittsburgh had over 12 family sites in the city. I believe now they only have 2. Northview Heights and Allegheny Dwellings. One-for-one kicked out, national groups, local groups, everybody fought it, and we lost. We lost on one-for-one replacement. And so saying that now as we go forward, they're doing something, as you know, with choice neighborhoods and the rental assistance demonstration programs where they're looking to move or build units out into the neighborhood, but not necessarily at the number that was lost, which got to my earlier thing about supply and demand, because here in Pittsburgh, we are over about 21,000 units short on units, period, across the board. So trying to make up that disparity in numbers, I don't think is going to happen. It's definitely not going to happen with any choice neighborhoods that go forth, even if they're fully funded. There's several on the books here. Bedford Dwellings is a proposed choice neighborhood development. I don't know what's in the works for Northview. There's been a lot of discussions about Northview, the senior high-rise up there and everything else, so don't know what's up. So most of the city, under current administrations, was to sell off all performing units and demolish all underperforming units. And that's what's happened. So I don't think we're going forth for the next 50. I don't know what that increase will be. I'm very suspect of what that might look like because there is not money to be made. In other words, when the Housing Authority stopped building units, okay, as a public agency, and they put it into the hands of for-profit private folks, the economic incentive became not to build for poor people.
Right.
So therefore, going forth, I don't know where we're going to be in that debate, in that talk, of what's going on. So I think we will continue to be at a loss of units, no matter where we go forth moving on. I hope that answered your question.
It does, but doesn't that beg the question of the city's obligation under AFFH to look at whether or not that creates a further concentration of poverty and segregation? I mean, my thought is, and I understand your point, because I feel the frustration, if I kind of put it kind of out there. But then, if that's the city's position, and including a choice neighborhood, then where are they with respect to their obligation to affirmably further fair housing if they are, if the outcome of that, and the outcome of lowering the number of affordable housing in those locations turns into a new concentration, racial concentration in new areas, right? Because one of the things that we see when there isn't a number of affordable housing available in those neighborhoods is that kind of first-ring suburban concentration, right?
Right.
And new, for Pittsburgh, new form of segregation. So if the city isn't providing the number of affordable housing, and the outcome of not providing affordable housing is to create new segregation, doesn't that fly in the face of their obligation to affirmatively further fair housing?
I would agree, but I would say that the way I believe they're trying to get around it is increasing the payment standards on their vouchers. The city has now they went from the family units that they used to have to a majority of Section 8 housing choice vouchers. Right. Okay? And so now, sort of trying to get around what you were just saying by upping the payment standards in certain neighborhoods, certain zip codes, right, would effectively help them get around what you were saying. I don't know that's necessarily going to be the case, but that might be the thought process behind it. I would defer, I think the folks who were with the Housing Authority left, you know what I mean? So, because as you just said, and the gentleman in his maps before, it's been documented that at least over the last several years, at least 10,000 black folk have left the city and moved to first ring suburbs because of the affordability piece. Oh, wow. Okay? So again, and also understanding that the city has a turnback rate on its housing choice vouchers of almost 50%. So which adds to the dilemma. So I hear what you're saying, but that's a conversation that we need to have with the Housing Authority and to the city of Pittsburgh, as Barbara was saying, with their CDBG and with the consolidated plan and with the Housing Authority plan. We need to have those questions answered so it gets to that question.
I have to add a little piece on this, because just underscoring and agreeing with everything you put on the table, the United Way is trying to provide services outside the city now because those people that have been pushed out to the suburbs, they don't have transportation to get to the little job they had, okay? Affordability in terms of home ownership and affordability in terms of rental is making the fair housing concept something that is not in reach of many Americans that it used to be in reach of. And so just when you look at the lack of affordable housing, when you look at a lot of banks now aren't doing the mortgages, you can give me testimony. The banks were doing, because there's no money in it, and we have more and more people that are being stifled in terms of their quality of life because they got pushed out of East Liberty or someplace else. So the issue you're raising is an issue that we all need to be in collaboration together with to try to help the city of Pittsburgh see it. And those numbers are greater than 10,000. And most of them are African Americans. But that is a serious issue. And homeownership is becoming more and more a thing of the past. We were talking during break because folks that are going to college, they got to pay back loans and just everything in the housing industry is going up. So when we talk about fair housing, who's going to own these homes?
We are. The community needs to step up. When the Housing Authority advocated its responsibility to care for their properties and to enforce standards on voucherized properties, it created a void. It created, when they start disinvesting in their housing, it caused it to get worse. I mean, they pulled the police force off. Of course, crime is going to increase. Everything that happened in public housing communities was by design. I mean, they intentionally stopped the money from flowing. They intentionally stopped repairing, start investing capital money in the properties. And everybody knows you live somewhere, you got to take care of it. But the people that were living there weren't necessarily in charge or able to be able to take care of it. But the housing authority didn't do it either, and they're still not doing it. One of the things I wanted to talk about was the disparate impact that mass eviction has on communities and individuals. And to me, sitting up here saying, oh, we're the Fair Housing Partnership or it's Fair Housing Day, when I know the personal hurt and pain of being displaced 3 or 4 times. And it happens in our city over and over again. And to me, it's a violation of the Fair Housing Act. It might not be intentionally harming people, but whether it intentionally harms or if it in fact harms, then it's having a disparate impact on a protected African American class. When thousands of African Americans in this city are being herded around from place to place like cattle. And it's disruptive to and the issue is and the housing authorities caused it intentionally. I mean, if you look at the number of units that were short 21,000, that's probably the number. Oh, that's probably the number we demolished. You know what I'm saying? This whole thing is intentional. It's by design. It's around making money for developers and at the expense of poor people, and it really needs to stop. And people that believe in the Fair Housing Act is sort of our last hope if it has the power of enforcement, then why are these kinds of practices still prevalent? Because people are being violated. People's rights are being violated, hundreds at a time. And I listened to your stories about, the individual testing, and that's lovely. But, they just picking up hundreds of people and shuffle them around like they're toys on a, like they're toy soldiers on a battlefield. And is that not a crime? When you cause that kind of harm to a large group of people, is that not, that are protected, because they are black, is that not disparate impact? That's my question.
Good question.
So I'm going to try to answer your question. So absolutely, the department takes responsibility for perpetuating some of the segregation, displacement of housing. Again, my arm is the enforcement arm, right? The housing authority. So we work in tandem with the housing authority to say. So now when they talk about moving or tearing down developments, we're right there at the table with them saying, if you tear down a particular development, you need to submit to us your plan. What's going to happen to the residents that live there, right? So they have to think about fair housing when they're moving individuals with respect to, are they going to be displaced? Are they building additional units? Is it a 1-for-1 unit? Are they providing vouchers to those residents that don't want to stay? And so we're working in tandem with the housing authority to make sure that they don't violate the Fair Housing Act. Understandably so. Does it transpire? Absolutely yes. But again, it's going to be very important as residents. One thing that I can say to the residents of the city of Pittsburgh is prior to taking that action, before the development starts, go on your website, go to your city officials. It's a public document called the Consolidated Plan. All right? Your Office of Planning, they have to publish that document that tells you, the residents of Pittsburgh, what type of building or development is going to transpire within a 5-year period, okay? So you want to make sure you're at the table again, right? When they're talking about redevelopment and tearing down particular units. You want to be at the table to say, as residents, to say, hey, I think affordable housing, with respect to accessibility, we have individuals that have disabilities, there's not enough accessible housing in this particular community. So again, having those conversations prior to the startup of the development, because once the development is in action, it makes it a little bit more difficult. But however, one thing that you always have for ammunition is you can file a complaint if you feel like your rights have been violated based on your protected class, as you indicated, race, religion, disability. If you feel that it's in play, that you're being displaced or a particular development is being demolished because of your race, you can file a fair housing complaint, and then it would come to our office, and we would conduct an investigation. We would evaluate. We have complaints in our office all the time that are filed against a particular housing authority, right? But again, we're separate and apart. Even though we're one department, we're separate and apart. We're the enforcement arm. So if somebody comes to our office and says, I want to file a complaint against the Allegheny Housing Authority, right? We have offices all over. You can file a complaint with the commission on human relations. You can file a complaint with our FIP agency. But again, those are tools that residents can use if they believe that they've been discriminated against. And we take it very seriously.
You know, just add a small little piece to that, Ronell. You know, you make a good analogy of it, and I'll sort of take it another step further. I sort of make this analogy of where we're at to when Ronald Reagan broke the Air Traffic Controllers Union. We're still feeling that effect of what he did to this day. When the housing authorities were able, under HUD, to come up with another choice, back up, HOPE. You remember there was Hope 1, Hope 2, Hope 3, Hope 4, Hope 5, and then Hope 6.
Right.
And Hope 6 was the one that really came in and decimated our communities.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, it started on the Hill, went to Broadhead Manor, went to Westgate Village, went to St. Clair Village, Elmore Square, you name it. Okay? And so now we're having to play catch up. We're having to play, and I'm not putting the blame on nobody because we were all blindsided by this. As my friend from HUD says, at the table, we tried, and she's in the amends for past things. We're feeling those effects, and as Esther knows from her organization, because she used to see everything that was happening with home ownership and rental. She was helping folks, assisting folks in buying houses and helping them assist, and she was also helping on the rental assistance side, making sure that folks were stable and able to pay their rent. Because she, as the urban league, understood that while wealth building is home ownership, everybody could not be a homeowner. Right. She understood that. You understand me? But we were so onslaught by what had happened that we were not prepared, like most urban cities around. All these public housing communities set on what was then worthwhile land that became valuable land that was being reclaimed by the cities for repurposing.
That's right.
To change the demographic.
And so we all got caught up behind the 8 ball. You and I, Paulo Hammond, Bob, a bunch of folks in this room and others struggled mightily to deal with it. And we were not able to deal with it. And as a result, this is what we have right now. Folks from our families living around the suburbs, crime in our public housing communities because of funding cuts, because funding cuts was what knocked the Housing Authority police out the block. And now they have found some money miraculously to hire city police back. Yeah. That's amazing to me how they did that, but I will take it if it will keep our community safe. So we are behind the 8 ball. We're always we're at the table, but we're behind the 8 ball. I don't know how better to put it. You see what I'm saying? So, you know, we're there, we're at the table, but it's still happening. And this mayor came in, had a bunch of people sit on his housing planning forum, and I think it took him a long time to make one recommendation that we put before him, and that was the Housing Trust Fund. And that's still a little wavery, but it's out there. Yes.
The money's there.
Yes, indeed. So it's there, but anyway. So, but again, you know, Esther, I think, the whole panel was saying, you know, we got the dialogue got to keep on, and I don't know if Renelle hates to go to tables, but she's going to go to a few more. And we're going to keep this going because we got to.
We have to.
The conversation has to go, and we have to bring other allies to the table. You know, we got the realtors, so now we got to pull in the developers. You know, we got to pull in the educators. You got to pull in some other folk, you know, because this affects everybody. So this is what we got to do. So that's my little 10-minute gift of thanks.
And I'm just going to say, and I'm going to keep saying it, you have to hold your city officials accountable, all right? Because it's mandated. HUD, they receive federal dollars from the government to impart into their communities, and we're holding city officials accountable. It's mandated that they must affirmatively further fair housing. They must involve the community in their community planning. So again, making sure that your city officials that you elect, do they understand their role and responsibility with respect to development in your particular community? Or are they elected officials that really don't care about what's happening in the community, right? And so again, the impact of that, not electing the right city officials and knowing, you know, why they're at the table, right? Because again, as many of you have indicated, you're saying that you're at the table, but if you're not talking to the right officials, or if the officials, they're not educated with respect to affirmatively furthering fair housing and their role and responsibility because they receive federal dollars, then that's an issue. So again, the department is working with, that's one of our goals, is working with city officials to make sure they understand their role and responsibility, and if not, we're taking those cities, we're taking those cities to task, right? Because if they don't affirmatively further fair housing, they could lose their funding, right? There could be a complaint filed against a particular city or jurisdiction. I mean, so it's a much broader issue, because again, you really do have to really think about and understand and making sure your city officials are informed.
So this horrific habitability issue with a lot of publicly supported housing in our city. But the reality is that we can scream and holler and push a campaign, but there's other regs over here that says when they find that out, they got to shut it down. So, you know, how do we balance fair housing with getting what we need without, you know what I'm saying? Without displacement, you know? So people are living in substandard housing because there's nowhere else to go. And the government's paying for that. And if we jump up and down and scream about it, they'll come in and you'll shut it down. And then that'll be 300 more people displaced. You know what I'm saying? So this is very delicate, but we have to figure it out. Because I'm telling you people, I can show you people tents in the woods. You know, the housing crisis is real.
Oh, yeah.
It's real in this city. And the habitability issue, you know, just because we're an older city, our housing stock is older, you know, and thank God we do have a program now that can get some money in the pockets of landlords renting to Section 18, which might give a little bit of incentive. But, you know, we really have to sit down and come up with a solution that's real. Because and I think that we have over and over again. I done sat at more tables talking about Georgia income, you know, different policies that, like right now, a multifamily, you gotta go to every single development to get an application. They all use the same HUD lease. It's all basically the same application. Why can't they email them, or why do people have to get on a bus?
Oh my God.
I mean, just, you know what I'm saying? Think about the population that we're dealing with as well. And then they plop them people down at them meetings. This is a technical field. Community development, community planning, community change. They don't give the community no technical assistance, no capacity building, and expect for them to sit down with seasoned real estate and development professionals and hold their own. You know what I'm saying? There used to be money for capacity building and for people that live in low-income housing.
Great. So in the interest of time, we have time for one more question before we get some closing remarks.
Well, my name is Sherman Hobson, and I'm a Bedford dwelling resident. So, for 2 years, I've been going to the table. I've been minimized for 1.5 years. So finally, we're coming to the point where they're picking phases. They're picking phases, and they have to put in this implementation grant for they had a planning grant. They didn't bring no consultants in for the residents. We don't have a clue as to what they're supposed to be doing. They have a developer running the meetings. It's supposed to be tenant ran, resident driven. The train is down on Smithfield. We're still up on Bedford. We won't see the front of the train until it's on a bend because we have become the caboose. So at the end of the day, how can we be a part of something that's for us? And at the same time, it feels like these people are trying to take the money in which you've given us to better ourselves. So we're supposed to get $30 million to better our community, to better ourselves. And at the same time, you got the AI, which is getting higher every time they finish a development. The rent's going higher. So every time you finish the mill, the AI goes higher. So you got the market rate people coming, then you're going to have the affordable people, and then you're going to have the subsidized people. So what kind of dialect is the person who's on Social Security going to have with a person who makes $80,000, who goes to work in the morning and see the person at the door, comes home from work and see the person at the door? So I don't see that as being a mixed neighborhood, because their children are not going to want our children playing with their children. And at the end of the day, yes, at the end of the day, my question is this: who polices housing? Because, no, who polices housing? Because when I went to the federal building right here, and I went to the 10th floor, they let me in the back. It's nothing but a whole bunch of empty cubicles. So at the end of the day, you know what I mean? The people that are there are people that are older, just waiting to retire and get out. So at the end of the day, who's going to police these people when I've been writing them and calling them and at the meetings, you know, speaking humbly and trying to get them to understand that they're leaving us. They're running the train without us. There's no way. So I just want to know if I could get out of this meeting, who I could talk to, so that we could get some of that straightened out, because this train is about to get turned in by June. And they're already, and you know, if it's not in the plan, it's not going to happen. So we don't have nothing in writing. We don't have our rights written back to us. We don't have no way of knowing. If you separate it and spread it around the community, you separate us. So we don't have no more tenant council. We don't have nothing to speak up for ourselves. So what if another development comes back around and use the voucher program and raise it so high where we can't afford to pay the rent because of the voucher, because our income doesn't meet the voucher part of it. So what if they come back around and want to redevelop again? We don't have nothing in writing. We can't even stay in the community. So we don't have the community no more. So I just want to try to, my goal is, like she said, stay at the table, go at the end again. I've been doing that since these people came. And it just feels like I've been minimized. It feels like every time I speak up, they want to talk around me like I don't know what I'm talking about. I have a law degree from Duquesne University. They keep minimizing my education. I'm not a dummy. That's what you do to kittens. I'm a lion. I keep roaring, but they're not hearing me. So somebody can please explain that to me. Or give me some information so I could go see somebody. I have a complaint in the Human Relations Commission in the state. I have a complaint with HUD, you know, and all this stuff, they're dragging their, I'm saying they're dragging their feet, but the stuff, the time that they're taking to address the situation while the train is still running. So by the time they give me even the right to sue or something like that, the train's gonna already be in Monroeville. How am I catch the train? How are the people where I live, all the people that live in my community, how are we gonna catch that train? We're already the caboose. So I just need somebody to explain to me how I could go about stopping this railroad. That's all.
Oops, I defer to my colleagues.
Well, you know, I feel for you, my brother. And no, I say that, I mean, you did everything that you've heard us tell you to do. You've done everything that you've heard from us up here. And you still, I think my friend over there, Skip, has said it pretty much. By the time you do something and you get a hearing or anything else, the train is left and you're gone, and there's nothing you can do about it. You're faced with decisions that you have to make immediately or else. You either fight, as Rennell knew when we had a lady out in East Liberty, the only one that held out in the townhomes, that we had to run a cable of electricity from the church all the way down to her house. And they tore down all around her.
She stayed.
And she stayed. And she stayed. And my brother, I don't know what to tell you, sir. I feel your frustration. You've heard the young lady tell you what you need to do. My suggestion, when this great panel discussion is over, you corner that young lady. you give her your telephone number, and you take her telephone number and say, help. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. And I was going to say that.
And say help. That's the best thing I can tell you, sir.
I wrote Washington, the people that was giving them the money, and they wrote me back and said stay engaged, and they was Michelle Blue. The last name was Blue.
Okay.
Well, that just nothing ever came to that.
Sir, you've got somebody right in front of you right now.
And if you have a complaint, we could talk afterwards. If you have a complaint that's filed, if you give me your case number, I can definitely look it up and see what's happening with your particular case, so we can talk afterward as well.
Yeah.
Great. So, on behalf of the City of Pittsburgh, the residents of the City of Pittsburgh, the Commission on Human Relations, I want to say thank you to all of you for taking part of your busy day to be with us today. We really, truly appreciate it. And we hope that the information that was shared today was useful for your efforts to further fair housing in our city. Thank you so very much. So, to close us off, we are going to welcome to the podium Elizabeth Fishback, who's the regional director with the offices of Senator Casey. Ms. Fishback, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Moses. Yeah, that's really big up there. Well, I've been a fellow audience member for about an hour, and the conversations and the questions were incredible to listen to. So thank you for letting me be a part of that for the past hour. I apologize, I'm a poor substitute for the senator himself, but as many of you probably know, they're in Washington this week voting and listening to Mr. Zuckerberg. So they are down there, and so I am here with you. As Carlos said, my name is Liz Fishback. I'm the regional director for the senator here in Pittsburgh, and we run the southwest corner, 13 counties in the southwest corner of Pennsylvania. So I will keep my remarks brief because it sounds like I'm wrapping things up. If I may quote Mr. Moses and use his word of ally, that's certainly what Senator Casey is in this struggle. The senator believes every person truly does have a right to a home. Without a home, it's impossible for individuals and families to focus on anything else. A safe, affordable home and a secure home is truly integral to the success of individuals and families. The senator has consistently supported HUD's programming for this reason, to assist in first-time homeowners and to help address the current affordable housing crisis, among many other issues. Prior to the passage of the landmark Fair Housing Act, landlords, home sellers, real estate companies, and lenders could and often did discriminate against certain individuals and families. Despite Supreme Court decisions which outlawed the exclusion of African American and other minorities from certain sections of cities' race-based housing patterns, and discrimination still existed in many communities across this country. Thanks to the work of the civil rights groups, activists, and leaders, Congress passed the Fair Housing Act to protect people from discrimination when they were renting, buying, or securing financing for any housing. Initially, the Act's prohibitions only covered race, color, national origin, and religion. 6 years later, the Act was amended to include for protections for sex, and 20 years after that, the bill's initial passage, protections were added for the disability and for those with disabilities and for the presence of children. Over the past 50 years, the Fair Housing Act has evolved, and the work with the Commission on Human Rights and other organizations has done a lot to help improve upon this important law. All of your efforts and the folks who were just on stage continue to help Congress and HUD to make the necessary changes to ensure our housing system really is fair for all. As we celebrate 50 years of this historic legislation that's been uplifting racial minorities and other protected classes, we still see troubling examples of discriminatory practices across our nation. Unfortunately, as a recent example in February, the Center for Investigative Reporting unveiled a report about modern-day redlining. Banks are routinely denying, and I think that Esther alluded to this, conventional mortgage loans to African American and Latino Americans at far higher rates than their white counterparts. After that report came out, Senator Casey, along with State Senator Vincent Hughes, who is in Philadelphia, sent a letter to the Department of Justice, urging Attorney General Sessions to investigate these findings of discrimination in the residential mortgage lending market. Even as we celebrate this historic moment, there is clearly still more work to be done to completely eradicate the practice of housing discrimination. Senator Casey will continue to be a partner and an advocate in that struggle and support policies that make our housing system fair and ensure equal treatment under the law. And if you have any questions or you have concerns or if you need assistance from the senator, and even finding out where to go, even with all the resources available, we're happy to be that resource and that pathway for you. We have 7 offices across the state and additionally in DC, so please do not hesitate to call. My name is really big up on that screen right now. Google Bob Casey in Pittsburgh, give us a call, and we will try and do all we can to assist you. Thank you very much for letting me join you today. I'm very grateful.
Thank you, Ms. Fishback. One thing that we want to make sure, for those of you who had a question or a comment, you did not get a chance to ask your question or comment, we have postcards at the registration table in the front. If you leave your information, leave your question or your comment, we will make sure to follow up and get you that feedback. Otherwise, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to be with us. We really appreciate it. Have a good evening.